Welcome to BeFrightened. We tell stories that will keep you up or help you sleep at night. Thank you for joining me. Get comfortable and grab a glass of water. Before we begin, make sure you've locked your doors, closed your windows, and turned off the lights. While you're getting cozy, don't forget to say hello in the comments and like and subscribe to BeFrightened for more scary stories. These stories are a compilation sourced from our most recent videos, so you might recognize some of them. Now, it's time to close your eyes and enjoy the journey. Sweet dreams, and I'll be seeing you in your nightmares. But hopefully not. This happened many years ago when I was about 14. I grew up in a small rural town, in a single-story ranch house at the edge of a dense forest. Our home was isolated, with the nearest neighbor a good half-mile away. It was a peaceful place, perfect for a quiet life, but also quite eerie at night. Being the oldest of three, my parents still didn't trust me to babysit my younger siblings alone overnight. So they hired a babysitter. She was 17, a friend from school, and someone I trusted. It was a typical winter night, cold with a clear, star-filled sky. The ground was covered in a blanket of snow that reflected the moonlight, making the night seem almost bright. My siblings were asleep, and I was up reading in the living room. The babysitter was in the kitchen, getting a snack. Suddenly, my brother called my name in a panicked whisper. I thought he was having a nightmare, but then I saw him standing in the hallway, eyes wide with fear. He pointed towards the back door and said,
"There's someone outside."
I felt a chill run down my spine. I crept to the back door and peeked through the window. In the dim light, I saw a figure standing just beyond the porch, half hidden in the shadows. The figure was swaying slightly, as if unsteady on their feet. Panic surged through me. I quickly went to get the babysitter. She came to the door, and we both stared at the figure.
"What should we do?"
She asked, her voice trembling. I had no idea. I decided to call our only neighbor. He was a retired police officer, and I just hoped that he would be home. I grabbed the landline phone and dialed his home phone number. After a few rings, he answered. I explained the situation, and he said he'd come over right away. We watched as the figure began to move, stumbling closer to the house. I could see now that it was a man. His clothes were disheveled and dirty. His face was obscured by the shadows, but I could tell something was very wrong. I noticed that his hands were shaking, and he seemed to be mumbling something under his breath. As he got closer, the dim porch light revealed his gaunt, hollow eyes and a look of sheer desperation. The babysitter and I locked all the doors and windows, then gathered my siblings in the living room. We huddled together, waiting for our neighbor to arrive. The man outside started banging on the back door, his fists hitting the wood with alarming force. He shouted, his voice slurred and desperate. Each bang of his fist sent vibrations through the house, making it feel like the walls themselves were trembling. I shouted back, "We can't help you. Go away." My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it would burst out of my chest. The babysitter was holding my youngest sister, who was crying softly. My brother was clutching a flashlight, his knuckles white with fear. The banging grew louder, and the man's shouts became more frantic. He started kicking the door, causing the frame to shake. I was terrified that he would break in. My brother and sister clung to me, their eyes wide with fear. The babysitter's face was pale, and I could see her struggling to keep it together for our sake. Suddenly, The man stopped banging. There was a moment of silence that felt like an eternity. I dared to hope that he had gone away, but then I heard the sound of glass breaking. I turned to see the man trying to force his way in through a window he had shattered. The babysitter screamed, and we all backed away, unsure of what to do. I grabbed a kitchen knife, my hands shaking, ready to defend my siblings. The man's frantic efforts to get in became more violent. He was halfway through the broken window, his wild eyes darting around the room, when the sound of our neighbor's truck pulling up the driveway interrupted him. He paused, looking momentarily confused, before scrambling back out of the window and disappearing into the shadows. Our neighbor, flashlight in hand, approached the house cautiously. From inside, we watched as he shone the light around, searching for the intruder. He signaled to us that it was safe to open the door. The babysitter and I hesitated, but finally unlocked and opened the door slightly to let him in. He instructed us to stay inside while he checked the perimeter. We could hear our neighbor talking to the man outside, his calm voice a stark contrast to the frantic shouts from earlier.
"You need to leave these folks alone,"
we heard him say. The man muttered something in response, but we couldn't make out the words. Our neighbor's presence brought a small measure of comfort, but we were still on edge, every noise making us jump. The police arrived shortly after. They informed us that the man was probably a transient, likely lost and confused. They said that he appeared to be under the influence of something. They took him away, and our neighbor stayed with us until my parents came home. Turned out that he was a drifter who had been wandering aimlessly and was under the influence of drugs. He had no idea where he was or what he was doing, which explained his erratic behavior. I still feel bad that I didn't help him, but I was just a scared kid. My parents didn't go out without us for a while. For years, I was traumatized coming home at night, but my brother still loves to mimic what I said that night. Bastard. It was a late September night, and I was driving home from a friend's place in Lake Placid, New York. The road was familiar, a quiet, winding route through the woods, surrounded by tall trees on both sides. There were no streetlights out here, and at this hour, there were no other cars either. It was just past 11 p.m., and the darkness felt overwhelming. The only sound was the hum of my engine and the occasional rustling of leaves. I'd driven this road plenty of times, but there was always something unsettling about it at night, and I always hated driving it. The woods felt more threatening in the dark, making everything seem off. I was tired and just wanted to get home as quickly as possible. The road stretched ahead, empty and quiet, but because of the winding turns, I was driving slowly, when suddenly I heard shouting from the side of the road. It was a man's voice. Loud, frantic, and crazy. I slowed down, pulled over to the side, and turned off the engine to listen. The shouting continued, but I couldn't make out the words. It sounded like he was in some kind of trouble. I grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment, got out of the car, and pointed the light toward the noise. I called out, asking if anyone needed help. For a moment, there was silence, then the sound of footsteps crunching through the bushes. A man stumbled out of the darkness. His clothes were dirty, and his hair was wild. He was clutching a large stick and seemed agitated. His eyes were wide with fear. He shouted at me to stay back, warning that something was coming, and I needed to get out of there. He kept glancing around like he was expecting to see someone or something. I could tell he wasn't thinking clearly. He seemed terrified. muttering about how they were after everyone. I kept my distance, trying not to startle him. I told him I wasn't there to hurt him and that I would leave. He kept shouting, his voice rising in panic as he talked about them. He was still waving the stick around, acting like he was fighting off invisible threats. I decided it was best to leave. I backed away, got into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. I didn't waste any time getting out of there, driving away quickly. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing at the edge of the woods, still yelling and waving his stick. When I got home, I called the police to report the incident. They said they'd send someone to check it out. I didn't hear anything more after that. I was just relieved to be safe. Whatever that man thought was in the woods, I had no intention of ever finding out. I tried to forget about it and move on. A few days later, a missing person alert was issued for a man fitting the description of the one I saw. He was reported missing by his family, who hadn't seen him for weeks. The alert mentioned he had a history of mental health issues and had been known to wander off before. At the time, I couldn't help but wonder if he was still out there in those woods, lost or hiding from whatever he believed was coming for him. The pain had started as a dull ache in my lower back, something I could mostly ignore. But over the months, it turned into something much worse, sharp, shooting pains that radiated down my legs, making every step a challenge. Simple tasks, like getting out of bed or bending down to tie my shoes, became unbearable. I'd always been active, hiking the trails around Seattle and jogging along the waterfront. But the pain took all that away. I was desperate for relief. I tried everything: physical therapy, acupuncture, a series of increasingly stronger pain medications, but nothing seemed to help. After a few months, my primary care doctor in Seattle referred me to a spine specialist at a local clinic. An MRI confirmed what they suspected: a herniated disc pressing against my spinal nerves. The specialist explained that I needed a lumbar discectomy, a procedure to remove the damaged portion of the disc that was causing all my problems. It sounded terrifying, but the doctor assured me it was routine, something they did regularly. They said I'd be in and out of surgery in a few hours, and with a bit of rest, I'd be back to normal life in no time. I wanted to believe them. The thought of finally being free from the pain was all I could think about. The idea of walking without wincing, of sleeping through the night, of getting back to my old self, that was the hope I held on to as the surgery date approached. I signed the consent forms, spoke with the anesthesiologist, and tried to push away the creeping anxiety. This was supposed to be the solution, but I had no idea that the real nightmare was about to begin. The day of the surgery, I checked into the clinic early in the morning. The waiting room was already filling up with patients, but I barely noticed. My mind was a blur of anxiety and anticipation. The wait dragged on until finally a nurse came to escort me to the pre-op area. She took my vitals and went over the procedure one last time. I nodded along, feeling very tense. Soon, another nurse arrived with a wheelchair. I was wheeled down a long, sterile hallway and into the operating room. The room was brightly lit and much colder than I expected. I was helped onto the operating table, lying face down. They positioned me carefully, placing supports under my chest and legs to keep my spine aligned. The anesthesiologist approached, adjusting the IV in my arm. He said I might feel a pinch and told me to start counting backwards. I felt a prick in my arm, and a cold sensation started to spread. The last thing I perceived before my vision blurred was the surgical team preparing their instruments. I expected darkness to follow. But as the minutes passed by, I realized something was wrong. I could still hear the doctors talking, hear the clinking of metal instruments. I wasn't unconscious. I wasn't out of it. I could still feel the cool air on my back, the pressure of the supports, and then I could feel the sharp pain of the first incision. I was fully awake, trapped in a body that wouldn't respond. The scalpel cut into my lower back, and I felt a searing pain shoot through my body. I wanted to scream, but my mouth wouldn't move. I felt every slice, every tug as they worked on my spine. I could hear the surgeon instructing his team, felt the burn of the cauterizing tool as it sealed off small blood vessels. The pain was indescribable, like a fire spreading through my nerves. Tears formed in my eyes, but they couldn't see my face. I was lying prone, hidden from their view. For what felt like an eternity, the procedure continued. I was still, paralyzed, but I could hear the beeping of the monitors. My heart rate was climbing. The anesthesiologist must have been distracted, focused on something else. The anesthesiologist suddenly became alarmed and said something was wrong. Finally. He seemed to notice that my vital signs were rising rapidly and suggested that I might be feeling the pain. The surgeon responded by instructing the anesthesiologist to increase the anesthesia. I couldn't see them, but I heard quick movements and a soft click as the machine was adjusted. A warm sensation spread through my body, and the pain started to fade. The sounds around me grew quieter, and I felt myself drifting into darkness. When I woke up, I was in the recovery room. My back throbbed, but the intense, sharp pain was gone. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy and weak. I could hear the steady beeping of monitors and the low voices of nurses nearby. One of them noticed I was awake and came over, speaking softly, telling me to relax and that the surgery was over. A doctor I didn't recognize came in a few minutes later. He had a serious look on his face, and he carefully explained there had been issues with the anesthesia during the surgery. They were looking into what had happened, he said, but didn't provide much detail. I lay there, processing his words, trying to make sense of it all through the haze of medication. The doctor mentioned they were reviewing the anesthesiologist's actions, and that an internal investigation was underway. A week later, while I was at home, I got a call from the hospital. They said it was a rare complication, something about a technical error and miscommunication. There was no real apology, just a formal explanation and a promise to prevent it from happening again. They offered to cover my medical expenses and any necessary follow-up therapy. But there was no mention of taking further action. The experience left me rattled, but there didn't seem to be much I could do. I am not the litigious type and didn't want to relive the experience in court. The ordeal was over. The pain had subsided, but the memory of that day hasn't gone away. When I first moved to a small town in Ohio for college, I took a job at a quaint, family-owned Italian pizzeria to help with my expenses. The pizzeria was a short drive from my new off-campus apartment, where I was living alone. It was run by an older man known as Big Tony, along with his 3 sons and a friend. I was the only woman on the team, a young college student looking to earn some extra money. My jobs ranged from delivering pizzas to helping out around the pizzeria. On my first day, Big Tony suggested that I help out in the back kitchen during the late hours when the place was closed, and well and truly after my shift had ended. He said it would help me learn the ropes better, but I had a bad feeling about it. I declined, citing my college schedule, but he kept pressing. When I refused again, he became cold, his friendly demeanor vanishing. In the days that followed, during my initial shifts, he seemed to always find an excuse to linger nearby. He insisted on accompanying me during deliveries, claiming it was to help me learn the routes. He was overly familiar, often brushing against my shoulder or placing a hand on my thigh, his touch lingering longer than necessary. Things took a turn when he started asking personal questions. He asked if I had a boyfriend, to which I replied yes, even though he lived in Canada. Big Tony then casually mentioned that he was having his bathroom remodeled and needed a place to stay for a few days. Without hesitation, he suggested that he could crash on my couch, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. I firmly declined. Things took a darker turn when he showed up, unannounced, at my off-campus apartment building one night after my shift, claiming he was just in the neighborhood and wanted to check in on me. I was taken aback, especially since he mentioned details about my building's security system, saying it seemed too easy to bypass. He also mentioned a recent break-in nearby and suggested I should be extra careful, especially living alone. I felt trapped and intimidated, unsure of how to respond. One afternoon, as I was getting ready to leave for work, I noticed that one of my car tires was almost completely flat. Frustrated and unsure what to do, I was about to call for roadside assistance when, as if on cue, Big Tony pulled up in his car and, flashing a grin, asked if I needed some help. It was too coincidental, like he had been lurking around, waiting for this moment. Reluctantly, I accepted his help, as I needed the car for my shift. As he changed the tire, he made small talk, dropping in comments like,
"Good thing I happen to be nearby.
and
Always best to have someone around, just in case, right?"
his words, though casual, left me feeling uneasy. A few days later, I found myself in another uncomfortable situation. After a late shift at the restaurant, I tried to start my car to head home, but the engine wouldn't turn over. I was baffled. I had just been out delivering pizzas and had been back in the restaurant for barely half an hour, only to grab my things and say goodnight to the other staff. As I was considering my options, Big Tony appeared seemingly out of nowhere. He asked,
"Engine not starting, love."
before I had even mentioned the problem. His sudden appearance was unsettling. Without waiting for a response, he popped the hood and began working near the battery. After a moment, while tightening a clamp, he noted that it was a loose connection and remarked on how fortunate it was that he was still around. It felt as if he had been watching and waiting for this exact moment, with his timing seeming almost too perfect, as if he had orchestrated the whole thing. The final straw came when Tony began leaving small, unwanted gifts addressed to me on my apartment building doorstep. Flowers, a bottle of wine, and once even a small box of chocolates. While these might seem harmless on their own, his comments the next day at work, like asking if I enjoyed the wine or if the chocolates were too much, gave them an unsettling undertone. The gifts, combined with his constant unwelcome attention, felt increasingly uncomfortable and creepy. You guessed it. I quit. I've been working at a small distribution center for a couple of years now. It's a pretty nondescript building, the kind you might drive by without giving a second thought. The company specializes in general consumer goods, so we move a lot of electronics, household items, and the like. I work the night shift, usually by myself, since the job mostly involves paperwork, inventory counts, shipment confirmations, and the occasional security check. It's a quiet job, which is exactly what I wanted after the issues I had with a colleague at my previous job. Well, that is a story for another day. One night, while I was updating inventory records in the back office, I heard a faint jiggling sound coming from the side entrance. It's a door that's only supposed to be used by staff, and we keep it locked at all times. Intrigued, I walked over to check it out and saw a man peering through the small window in the door. He seemed to be trying to see inside. I froze for a moment, then moved closer to the door. As soon as he saw me, he started knocking on the glass and trying the handle again. "The door's locked," I said firmly through the glass. "You need to leave. This area isn't open to the public." The man stared at me for a moment, his eyes narrowing as if trying to gauge whether I was serious. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. I watched him until he disappeared around the corner of the building. It was unsettling, but I convinced myself it was just some guy who had gotten lost or was confused about where he was. Later that night, unable to shake the feeling, I called a friend who used to work security. I explained what had happened, hoping for some reassurance. He suggested it might just be some prankster messing around, trying to downplay the situation, but I could hear the concern in his voice. He mentioned that if the man returned again, that it might be worth considering leaving the premises for a while, as it wasn't worth putting my safety at risk. His words lingered with me long after we hung up. The idea of leaving my post felt wrong, but the unease I felt only deepened. After that unsettling encounter, the rest of the week passed without incident, and I started to think maybe it was just a one-time thing. But then, the following week, the man started coming back again. He tried different doors, once the main entrance, another time the loading dock door. Each time, I would tell him to leave, and each time he would hesitate, as if considering whether to listen, before finally walking away. My unease grew with every encounter, but I didn't call the police, hoping he would eventually just stop. That was my mistake. Then, one night, things escalated. I was in the middle of filling out a shipment form when I heard a loud bang on the loading dock door. It was so forceful that the metal echoed throughout the building. My heart pounded as I approached the door. Through the small window, I saw the same man, this time looking more determined, almost angry. He was trying to force the door open. His face set in a grim expression. "This is private property. I'm calling the police," I shouted, my voice shaking slightly. The man stopped what he was doing and stared at me through the glass, his expression unreadable. After what felt like an eternity, he slowly backed away and disappeared into the darkness. I immediately called the police, explaining what had been happening over the past few nights. The next day, I told my manager everything. He pulled up the security footage, and together we watched as the man appeared on the recordings night after night. Sometimes he would just stand outside the doors. Other times he would try the handles, or simply watch the building from a distance. The police patrolled the area for the next few nights, but he never returned while they were there. Even after the patrols stopped, I couldn't help but feel that he might come back. I found myself glancing over my shoulder constantly, jumping at every little sound. The memory of his determined expression as he tried to force his way inside still haunts me to this day. I don't know what he wanted, but I hope I never find out. Fresh out of the military, after 2 tours in Afghanistan, adjusting to civilian life hadn't been easy. Nightmares and hypervigilance made sleep elusive, so when a night shift security position opened up at a small local mall in New Jersey, it seemed like the perfect fit. A way to put those sleepless hours to use while figuring out the next steps. In December 2023, the mall was quiet after hours, its corridors empty and storefronts dark, offering an eerie backdrop to the new job. The first 3 nights passed without any incident. Patrols, lock checks, and camera monitoring filled the hours. On the 4th night, something changed. During a walkthrough of the West Wing, something about a mannequin in a store window appeared off. At first glance, it seemed like its head had turned slightly, now facing the corridor. A second later, it was back in its original position, leaving an unsettling sense that something wasn't right. That moment marked the beginning of a series of inexplicable events within the mall's walls. I started my patrol as usual, heading down the West Wing. Halfway through the corridor, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, expecting to see a late cleaner perhaps, but saw no one. I resumed walking. The footsteps started again, matching my pace. I spun around quickly. The hallway was empty. The footsteps stopped with each pause, only to resume when I moved again. With every patrol loop, they seemed to draw closer. I changed my patrol route and headed towards the food court. The footsteps continued, trailing behind. I picked up my pace and looked for anything out of place. I spotted movement between the tables in the food court, a shadowy figure in the distance that I couldn't make out. "Security," I called out. "Come out now." The figure moved again, moving towards the far end. I followed the figure. It seemed to stay just out of sight, slipping from shadow to shadow. Despite my best efforts to catch up and get a clear look, it remained elusive. The radio crackled with static, whilst I went to report the possible intruder. In my time prior, and time since, I have had no such reception issues with the radio in the mall. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, the PA system came to life. An unfamiliar voice came on, announcing the closing time for stores long gone from the mall. My attempts to use the radio again proved futile. With the strange announcements continuing, the next logical step was to check the control room for answers about the PA system malfunction. The control room door was locked, as expected. Upon entering, everything appeared normal. The security monitors displayed their usual feeds, and the PA system console was inactive. No sign of recent use or malfunction was evident. Returning to the patrol route, the disembodied announcements had ceased. The mall was silent again. The food court was empty. Suddenly, sounds erupted from the direction of the arcade. Footsteps mixed with the distinct chimes and beeps of game machines. Approaching the arcade, faint sounds became audible. The main gate was still locked, but a dim, flickering light could be seen inside. It seemed odd, given that everything should have been powered down hours ago. Using the master key, I unlocked the gate and pushed it open. Inside, a few of the older machines were blinking and beeping softly. It was strange. These machines shouldn't have power, let alone be active. Moving deeper into the arcade, one machine in particular caught my eye. Its screen flickered weakly, displaying what looked like an old game's start screen. As it came into full view, the screen suddenly went dark. In the silence that followed, the soft sound of footsteps could be heard again, this time from behind. Turning around, the arcade entrance was empty. The footsteps had stopped. A quick scan of the room revealed nothing out of place, aside from the few active machines. I decided to power down the arcade manually. The circuit breaker panel was located near the entrance. Upon opening it, all the switches were already in the off position. This didn't make any sense. How were the machines running? Just then, the radio crackled back to life. The night supervisor's voice came through, but the static made it very hard to understand. Before I could respond, the machines in the arcade abruptly went dark and silent, as they should have been all along. The radio cleared up, and the supervisor's voice came through again, this time much clearer. He had been on a break. He asked for details about the reported intruder, and then told me to meet him in the control room. He was on his way there. After a brief explanation of the strange events, I did a final sweep of the arcade. Everything seemed normal now. No flickering lights, no mysterious sounds. It was as if nothing had happened. I headed toward the control room, and the supervisor arrived a few minutes later. Together, we reviewed the security footage from the past hour. To my surprise, the cameras showed nothing unusual. Just empty corridors, a still, quiet arcade, and me making my rounds. Even when I was reacting to the strange events, nothing seemed out of the ordinary on the footage. It was as if all the weirdness had happened just off camera, or worse, in a way that the cameras couldn't capture. Once the supervisor left, I resumed my patrol, trying to shake off all the weirdness. Something still felt off though, but I continued my rounds. Nothing else out of the ordinary happened during that night shift. After that night, I experienced no other supernatural-ish events while working at the mall, thankfully. But I must admit, the days and weeks following, I really did dread going into work. Okay, so a few years back, my girlfriend Tracy and I found ourselves in a bit of a situation. We were living in Los Angeles, renting a cozy little apartment just outside of downtown. It was one of those charming old buildings, full of character, but also full of surprises, like the kind you don't want. Out of nowhere, a small leak in our kitchen ceiling turned into a full-scale disaster. Water started seeping through the walls, and before we knew it, the whole place needed urgent repairs. Our landlord informed us that the renovations would take at least a week, and we needed to vacate the property for safety reasons. Fortunately, the landlord was covering the cost, so finding a temporary place through Airbnb seemed like a hassle-free option. We wanted something close by, but far enough to feel like a little getaway. After searching through tons of listings, we finally came across one that seemed perfect. It was a small, standalone house, a quaint little bungalow nestled in a quiet neighborhood just on the outskirts of the city. The pictures looked great: bright, airy rooms, a small but fully equipped kitchen, and even a little patio with a view of the hills. It seemed private enough, which we thought was perfect for a bit of peace and quiet away from the chaos. Plus, the reviews were glowing. It seemed like the ideal spot for us to wait out the construction at home. Feeling pretty pleased with ourselves, we booked it without too much thought. We packed up a week's worth of essentials, hopped in the car, and headed over, looking forward to what we thought would be a calm, uneventful week in a cozy little hideaway. Little did we know, this stay would be anything but ordinary or uneventful. We got to the bungalow around mid-afternoon. The street was quiet, like the kind of place where people might nod hello, but not much more than that. The house looked just like the photos, small, with a little garden and a red door that made it pop. As soon as we stepped inside, the smell of cleaning products hit us. At first, we didn't think much of it. A clean place is always a good thing, but this was different. It wasn't just the usual lemony scent from a quick cleanup. It was strong, like someone had scrubbed the whole place down several times. Tracy noticed it too, but just shrugged. She said it was better than the place being dirty. Can't argue with that, I thought. I went to open some windows, hoping to air it out a bit. I mentioned that it should help, trying to keep things light. We walked around, checking out the place. It was okay, small but fine for a week. The living room had a sofa and a TV, a few generic pictures on the walls. Tracy went to look at the kitchen, and I went into the bedroom to put our stuff down. As I set our bags on the bed, I realized the smell was even stronger in there. It wasn't just bleach. There was something else to it, something that made my stomach twist a bit. But I tried to ignore it. We were here to relax, not get caught up in more stress. Tracy called from the kitchen, saying there was a welcome basket with some wine and snacks. It sounded like she was trying to find something positive to focus on. I joked that maybe if we got smashed enough on the wine, it would help us ignore the smell. Then, as I was about to walk out of the bedroom to join her in the kitchen, I glanced back at the bed and noticed something. There was a dark spot barely visible under the bed frame, which I hadn't noticed before. My heart started to race as I moved closer to get a better look. I crouched down, trying to see more clearly, and that's when I saw it. A dark stain on the floor, partially hidden by the bed. It wasn't just a stain. I knew right away it looked like dried blood, and there was a hell of a lot of it. I called Tracy over, trying not to sound as freaked out as I felt. She came in and saw my face, then looked down at the floor where I was staring. She guessed right away what it was. I didn't need to say anything. We both just stood there, staring. Tracy suggested we should call someone, but I insisted that we leave immediately. I grabbed our bags, and we made a quick exit toward the door, taking the welcome basket with us. Once outside, Tracy took out her phone. She said we should look up the address online, just to be sure. I watched as she typed it in. The first result was a news piece, titled something like, "Local Airbnb Scene of Recent Murder Investigation." It was from a month ago, same property, described just like the one we were in. A young woman had been killed right there in the bedroom. The details were vague, but they mentioned that the boyfriend had been arrested and was awaiting trial. The story described a romantic holiday gone terribly wrong. The couple had come from London, and things took a dark turn one night, ending in the tragic incident. There were still unanswered questions about what exactly led to the violent outcome. The overpowering smell of bleach made sense now. It wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about covering up a crime scene. Tracy contacted Airbnb customer service, explaining what we had found and mentioning the news article. The representative seemed caught off guard and assured us they'd investigate. Within minutes, they confirmed we'd get a full refund and said they'd reach out to the host for more information. While we waited for the refund confirmation, Tracy decided to call the host directly, asking why we weren't told about what had happened. The host didn't offer much beyond saying they had cleaned up the place thoroughly and felt there was no issue with listing it again. It didn't matter to us at that point. We just wanted to get out of there. After a quick search, we found another place to stay and left that bungalow behind. We were both relieved to be out of there, but the whole thing left a bad taste in our mouths. At least we got to enjoy that bottle of wine there, trying to laugh off what we just experienced. Back when I was in college, I went to a fairly big university. I had a small apartment not far from campus and needed to find a roommate, pronto. All my friends already had places lined up, so I turned to Craigslist to put up an ad. A guy named Edgar reached out in response to the ad and asked if he could come by to check out the place. I agreed, and later that afternoon, he showed up. He seemed pretty ordinary. Nothing particularly stood out about him. He mentioned he wasn't a student, but worked at the university as a janitor. Edgar seemed nice enough on the surface. Our conversation was normal, but for some reason, I couldn't shake this odd feeling about him. I didn't know what it was, just a sense of discomfort I couldn't put my finger on. After he looked around, he thanked me and left, and I told him I'd let him know soon if his application was successful. I was hesitant, not fully convinced at that time, hoping for another candidate. The following morning, I was struggling to get out of bed and was channel hopping on my small TV in my bedroom when I ended up on the news. They were covering a story about a recent assault case, and to my horror, they were reporting on the arrest of a suspect. When his photo appeared on the screen, I froze. It was Edgar, the same guy who had been at my apartment only the day before. I was in disbelief. I never contacted him again, and I probably couldn't anyway if he was behind bars. Fortunately, someone else had reached out later that day, and we hit it off. They moved in shortly afterward. I guess Edgar found accommodation after all. Just not the kind he was hoping for. Taking my kids to McDonald's was a treat I allowed myself, and them, every once in a while. It reminded me of my own childhood, when those brightly colored playgrounds felt like the most magical places on earth. One particular visit, however, changed my perspective entirely. It was a sunny Saturday, and my wife was at work. I decided to take our kids, Emily and Chris, out for some fun. We arrived around noon, and as soon as we stepped inside, the kids made a beeline for the play area. I joined the line to order their favorite meals, chicken nuggets and fries. The McDonald's was packed. Families filled every booth, and the noise of chatter and laughter filled the air. After what felt like an eternity, I finally got our food and headed to the play area. The kids were already deep into their playtime, climbing through the jungle gym and diving into the ball pit. As I watched them, I noticed a ginger-haired boy sitting in the ball pit. He looked different from the other kids. Not playing or smiling, just sitting there, almost frozen. His startled expression looked out of place in the bustling restaurant. I tried to brush it off as a kid having a bad day, but something about his expression nagged at me. Emily and Chris eventually came down to eat, and we settled into our meal. Despite the noise and chaos around us, my mind kept drifting back to the boy in the ball pit. A few minutes later, I saw the boy again. This time, he was walking slowly towards a woman who I assumed was his mother, fumbling with his clothes as he walked. My heart sank, and I felt a mix of protective concern and anger. I looked around, but no one else seemed to notice or care. I wanted to leave right then, but the kids were still eating, and I didn't want to cause a scene. I kept a close eye on them, making sure they stayed close and didn't go back into the playground. We finished our meal quickly, and I hurried them out of the restaurant, ignoring their protests. That night, the image of the ginger-haired boy stayed with me. His fearful expression and the way he hurried away replayed in my head over and over. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he just had an accident. Maybe his mother was handling it. But something about it didn't sit right. A few days later, I was reading the newspaper when an article caught my eye. The headline read something like, "Man arrested for assaulting children at local fast food restaurants." My heart pounded as I read the details. The incident took place at the same McDonald's we had visited. The man had been lurking in the play area, watching for moments when parents weren't paying attention. The article included a photo of a woman being interviewed, her face filled with worry and sorrow. I recognized her immediately. She was the mother of the ginger-haired boy. I felt a mix of relief and guilt. Relief that Emily and Chris were safe, and guilt for not acting on my instincts sooner. What if I had done something? What if I had alerted the staff or checked on the boy? Those questions haunted me for months. I arrived at my friend's weekend retreat cabin in the Appalachians after dark. The place was empty, miles from anywhere. I unloaded my photography gear and entered. As I set my bags down, I noticed a note on the kitchen table, written in my friend's familiar handwriting. It read, "Hi Ethan, enjoy your stay. The wildlife has been more active than usual. Be sure to keep your cameras ready. And don't let the isolation get to you. It's just the forest playing tricks. Matt." I smiled at the note. In hindsight, reading between the lines, I wish I had asked Matt what he really meant. But at the time, I dismissed it and set up my equipment efficiently, checking my plans for the week ahead. While reviewing my shot list, I heard a faint sound. It seemed to come from outside, but when I listened closer, there was only silence. Tired from the drive, I went to bed. Tomorrow would be an early start to capture the local wildlife. I woke at dawn and headed into the forest. The heavy silence was noticeable, but I pushed on. By midday, I'd captured several shots of the beautiful local wildlife: white-tailed deer grazing in a meadow, a red fox darting through the underbrush, and a pair of eastern bluebirds perched on a weathered fence post. During my hike, I felt an unexplained heaviness in certain areas, but dismissed it as my own overactive imagination. Later, I stumbled upon an abandoned campsite. Personal items were strewn around a collapsed tent, and unusual carvings marked a nearby tree. I photographed everything, assuming they were remnants of local traditions, but something about the scene felt off. Returning to the cabin at dusk, the scene I had encountered lingered in my mind. That night, the silence in the forest felt heavier than before. I tossed and turned, unable to relax. Sleep came eventually, but it was fitful. The next morning, I noticed my camera bag had shifted position. I was certain I'd left it by the door, but now it sat near the window. Outside, unfamiliar footprints led from the cabin into the woods. My unease grew. but I forced myself to focus on the day's photography plans. I set up game cameras around the clearing, hoping to capture nocturnal wildlife. As I worked, the feeling of being watched intensified. I spun around several times, expecting to see someone, but the forest remained still and empty. That evening, reviewing the day's photos, I noticed odd blurs in the background of several shots. They resembled humanoid shapes, but were too indistinct to identify. The following day, I hiked deeper into the forest. Drawn by the mysterious footprints, the atmosphere grew heavier with each step. Twice I whirled around, certain someone was behind me, but saw nothing. I stumbled upon another abandoned campsite. This one looked fresher, with signs of a recent struggle. Torn fabric littered the ground. More strange carvings marked the trees. My hands shook as I photographed the scene. Night fell faster than I expected. I realized I'd lost my bearings. Panic rose as I tried to retrace my steps. Instead, I found myself in an overgrown graveyard, weathered headstones unreadable in the dim light. After what felt like hours of wandering, I finally stumbled upon a familiar path and made my way back to the cabin, exhausted and on edge. I spent the next day reviewing my game camera footage. Most shots showed typical wildlife, but one sequence caught my attention. A deer appeared, then suddenly bolted. The following frames showed a dark, blurry shape moving through the trees. I replayed it several times, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The unsettling footage weighed on my mind, but I chose to push forward with my plan and explore the area as intended. Later, I hiked to a nearby stream to photograph water birds. I managed to capture a shot of a great blue heron standing majestically in the shallows and a belted kingfisher perched on a branch, eyeing the water below. As I set up my tripod, I noticed deep scratch marks on a tree trunk. They were too high and too wide to be from any local wildlife I knew of. I photographed them, making a mental note to research local bear populations later. Returning to the cabin, I noticed my laptop open on the table, even though I was certain I'd closed it before leaving. The screen displayed my photo gallery, paused on the images of the abandoned campsite. It was clear someone had been through my things. The following morning, I decided to venture deeper into the forest, following the same direction where I had seen the strange footprints earlier. My camera was ready as I navigated through the increasingly dense trees. The canopy blocked out more light, and the atmosphere grew heavier with each step. Despite the mounting tension, I was determined to uncover whatever was behind these disturbances. After an hour of hiking, I found myself back at the second campsite I'd discovered earlier. The one that had looked fresher and shown signs of a struggle. Now, it appeared even more disturbed. The torn tent and scattered gear seemed recently tampered with, as if someone, or something, had been here after me. Fresh carvings on the nearby trees, identical to the earlier ones, stood out. My hands were unsteady as I photographed the scene, the sense of mystery deepening. As I photographed the site, I noticed a narrow trail leading away from the campsite. I decided to follow it, thinking it might reveal more answers. Before long, I found myself back at the old, overgrown graveyard. The proximity of the two locations was unsettling, hinting at a connection I couldn't quite grasp. A figure at the edge of the graveyard caught my eye. I swung my light towards it, revealing a humanoid shape, oddly proportioned, its features indistinct in the shadows. My heart raced as I raised my camera, snapping several quick shots. The figure didn't move, but I felt an inexplicable urge to approach it. Fighting against this strange compulsion, I backed away slowly, then turned and ran. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever I'd seen. In my panic, I lost all sense of direction. The forest seemed to close in around me, unfamiliar and threatening. As exhaustion set in, I realized I had no choice but to wait for daylight. At first light, I oriented myself using the sun and hiked back. Exhausted, I returned to the cabin, which was unsettlingly quiet. Inside, I immediately downloaded the photos from my camera. The images from the graveyard were mostly blurry, except for one. It showed a dark, distorted shape among the trees, more like a shadow than a solid figure. I stared at it, my rational mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. This wasn't what I had come here for, and the strange occurrences were too much to overlook. Decision made, I started packing my gear. This expedition was over. As I gathered my belongings, I noticed something on the cabin door that made me freeze. A fresh carving, identical to those I'd seen at the abandoned campsites, was etched into the wood. It hadn't been there when I left yesterday. I took a photo of the carving and quickly packed my gear. As I drove away from the forest, I frequently checked my mirrors. The feeling of being observed persisted, even as I passed through farmland and reached the outskirts of town. Back home, I immediately began reviewing all my footage and photos. The game camera recordings showed brief, unexplained movements in the trees. The graveyard photo remained ambiguous. The figure could have been a trick of light and shadows. Yet the fresh carving on the cabin door defied rational explanation. I debated what to do with my findings. Part of me wanted to forget the whole experience, but my professional curiosity wouldn't let it go. I decided to contact a local historian, sending them photos of the carvings and asking if they had any significance in Appalachian folklore. Days later, an email from the historian arrived. They explained that the symbol resembled old Appalachian trail markers, but with unusual modifications. The historian asked if I had experienced anything out of the ordinary during my trip. I stared at the screen, unsure how to respond. As I contemplated my reply, movement in my peripheral vision made me turn. The room appeared normal, but something felt off. I closed the laptop without answering the historian's question. I was driving home late from my boyfriend's house in Bend, Oregon. It was already past midnight, and the roads were deserted. I didn't think much of it. I've driven this route countless times. It's a quiet stretch, winding through some dense woods. Something felt off tonight. The fog was dense, and my headlights didn't seem to do much. In hindsight, I probably should have stayed overnight at my boyfriend's, but I didn't want to impose, and I had a dentist appointment early the following morning. The dense fog was rolling in fast, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. I figured I could make it home if I took it slow. About halfway home, the car started making a strange noise. I slowed down, hoping it was nothing serious. But then, just like that, the engine sputtered and died. I coasted to the side of the road and tried restarting the engine. Nothing. Just the sound of a click and then silence. I was stranded. I checked my phone for service, but there wasn't any. I thought about walking back to the main road, but it was miles away, and the thought of trekking through the cold didn't appeal to me. I decided to wait a bit, hoping another car would pass. 10 minutes went by, then 20. The cold started seeping in, and I realized I couldn't stay in the car much longer. Out of the fog, I saw headlights approaching. I waved my arms, hoping they'd see me. The car slowed down and pulled up behind me. A man stepped out, looking to be in his late 40s, wearing a heavy coat and a hat. He asked if I needed help. I explained my car had broken down and I had no phone service. He nodded and offered me a ride to the nearest gas station. I hesitated for a moment, but figured I didn't have much of a choice. I got into his car and we started driving. The man didn't talk much, just kept his eyes on the road. I noticed a folder on the floor of the footwell at my feet, with newspaper clippings sticking out, stories about missing people. He noticed me looking and gave a tense smile, saying it was for a project. My unease grew, but I stayed quiet. As we drove further, I realized he wasn't heading toward any gas station I knew. I asked him again where we were going, and he responded with something vague. I started to feel really uncomfortable and told him I needed to get out. He just kept driving. Panic set in. I grabbed my phone, but of course, still no service. Suddenly, he turned onto a narrow dirt road. I demanded he stop the car, but he just looked at me and smiled. That's when I saw it. Up ahead, an old, abandoned cabin. My instincts kicked in. I reached for the door handle and threw myself out of the moving car. I hit the ground hard, but scrambled to my feet and ran into the woods, not looking back. I ran for what felt like hours, only stopping when I reached a main road. I had lost my phone when I jumped out of the car, so I flagged down a passing car. The driver, a woman, picked me up and drove to the nearest small town. Once we had service, she called the police for me. Thankfully, I made it out and didn't find out what he wanted to do with me. Throughout my life, I had always enjoyed good health, hardly ever visiting the doctor except for the occasional checkup. But as I got older, things began to change. About a year back, I started experiencing intense pain and heavy bleeding. At first, I brushed it off, thinking it was just another part of aging, but the symptoms only grew worse. Eventually, my gynecologist in San Antonio recommended a hysterectomy to address what they suspected was a severe case of fibroids. I was nervous about the surgery. I'd never had a major operation before, but the doctors reassured me it was routine. They went over the risks, the benefits, and the recovery process, emphasizing that this was a common procedure with a high success rate. I trusted them. They were the experts, after all. Little did I know, my ordeal was only just beginning. The day of the surgery, I arrived at the hospital early, feeling anxious as anything. After checking in, a nurse guided me to a pre-op room. I changed into a gown and lay down on a narrow bed as she inserted an IV into my arm, explaining it would deliver fluids and anesthesia. The anesthesiologist, a middle-aged man with a reassuring demeanor, came over next. He adjusted the IV and told me to start counting back from 10. I began counting, feeling like I was sinking into a deep sleep. 10, 9. I didn't even reach 7 before I was out. When I woke up, I was in a recovery room. The harsh light stung my eyes, and an intense, sharp pain radiated from my abdomen. I tried to move slightly, but every shift sent a wave of agony through me. I heard the steady beeping of monitors and the faint conversations of nurses nearby. One nurse noticed I was awake and came over, telling me the surgery was done and encouraging me to rest, saying the pain would ease up soon. I tried to speak, my throat dry, barely managing to whisper that it hurt, a lot. She reassured me that pain was normal after this type of surgery, but if it didn't improve, they'd notify the doctor. But the pain didn't just stay, it grew worse with each passing moment. Every breath, every tiny movement felt like knives twisting inside me. I kept pressing the call button, trying to make the nurses understand that something wasn't right. I kept telling them it wasn't normal, that the pain was unbearable. A day later, a different doctor came to check on me. He asked detailed questions about my symptoms, his expression growing more serious with every word I spoke. He finally said they needed to run some tests, just to make sure there were no complications. They wheeled me to the imaging department for an X-ray. The technician helped me onto a cold metal table, asking me to stay as still as possible while they took the pictures. I tried my best, fighting back the pain as they worked. After what felt like forever, they finished, and I was brought back to my room to wait. The doctor returned with a grave expression. He explained they had found something unexpected on the X-ray. A surgical instrument had been left inside my abdomen during the procedure. My mind went blank with shock. How could they leave something inside me? He went on to explain it was a retractor, and it had caused internal damage and an infection. They needed to operate again as soon as possible to remove it and fix the damage. My heart pounded with fear. Another surgery. I asked why no one had noticed a missing surgical instrument earlier, but he could only offer that they were still investigating how such a mistake could happen. As I was being prepared for the second surgery, I could sense the tension among the staff, hear the hushed conversations and hurried movements. Someone asked quietly how this oversight could have occurred. The anesthesiologist was more focused this time, telling me they needed to put me under again and to take deep breaths. Once more, I felt like I was sinking into a deep sleep. I could barely make out the voices around me before the room went dark again. When I woke up from the second surgery, the pain was still there, but it was different. Less sharp, more like a deep bruising ache. I felt groggy and disoriented, the after effects of the anesthesia still clouding my mind. A nurse came by, checking my vitals and asking how I was feeling. I could barely muster a response. I just wanted to know if they had fixed everything, if the nightmare was finally over. The doctor came in later, looking exhausted. He explained that they had successfully removed the retractor and repaired the internal damage as best they could. However, the infection had spread, and they'd need to monitor me closely over the next few days. I asked him how such a mistake could have happened, but his response was vague, something about a communication error during the initial procedure. I could see the discomfort in his eyes. He didn't have a real answer. I spent the next week in the hospital, hooked up to IV antibiotics and constant monitoring. Every day, I asked myself the same question: how could this have happened? The hospital administration eventually reached out, offering to cover all my medical expenses and providing a formal letter that amounted to little more than a cold apology. Though I was discharged after my infection cleared, my recovery was far from over. I had to undergo months of physical therapy and regular checkups. The scars weren't just physical. I filed a complaint against the hospital, but after months of back and forth, all I received was a small settlement and a hollow promise that changes would be made. I never fully regained my trust in the healthcare system. That experience left a lasting mark, one I'm still trying to heal from, both inside and out. About 7 months ago, during the height of the Australian summer, I had a strange and unsettling experience. I live alone in a small apartment in Sydney. I often ordered pizza. With temperatures reaching 35 degrees Celsius, the idea of cooking was unbearable, and delivery was my only option since I don't drive, and I didn't want to go outside in the heat. I'm the type who avoids wearing more than necessary, especially in the heat. That evening, I was lounging around in a newly purchased, light, comfortable camisole and thin shorts, my go-to type of outfit for such hot weather. As I was expecting a pizza delivery, I made sure to be somewhat presentable, knowing I couldn't exactly open the door in my underwear. When the doorbell rang, I grabbed my wallet and went to the door. The delivery guy handed me the pizza, and after a quick exchange, I took the box and shut the door behind me. Nothing seemed unusual. I sat down to eat while watching Netflix on my iPad, trying to enjoy my meal. Later that night, as I was relaxing on the sofa and scrolling through Instagram, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unfamiliar number. The text casually commented on my outfit and inquired if I was single, asking if I was enjoying my evening alone, ending with a suggestive smiley face and a chilly emoji. The message described my new outfit, something no one else had seen me wear. My stomach dropped. The only person who could have seen me like that was the delivery guy. I hesitated for a moment, then quickly typed back for confirmation. "Who is this? How did you get my number?" Instead of answering, the person sent another message. "Loved how that camisole clung to you. I can still picture it clearly now." My blood ran cold. They knew exactly what I was wearing. At this time, I was probably 90% certain it was the pizza delivery driver. The next day, still shaken, I tried to go about my routine. I had nearly convinced myself it was some kind of sick joke when around noon, I heard the doorbell ring again. I was in the shower at the time and couldn't answer immediately. When I eventually got to the door, there was no one there, but a pizza box sat neatly on the doormat with a note attached. "Just a little something extra from your secret admirer." The delivery guy was nowhere to be seen. I looked at the note, a sense of dread building. The fact that he had come back made me uneasy. I left the pizza on the doorstep and locked myself inside, feeling more anxious with each passing moment. A few days later, while I was still somewhat shaken by the recent occurrences, I was scrolling through Facebook to distract myself. I noticed a friend request from a name I didn't recognize. Curious, I clicked on the profile. At first, it seemed normal, just some funny memes and quotes. But as I scrolled a little bit further down their timeline, I froze. There it was, a photo of me sitting in my living room, taken from outside my window. My chest tightened. How did they get this picture? Scrolling down a bit more, I found another disturbing post. "Nice choice of dress today," with a timestamp from when I wore the green dress the previous day. Another post displayed the view from my kitchen window, clearly taken from outside. Then messages started pouring in on Facebook Messenger. "You should really keep your curtains closed," and "Hope you enjoyed the surprise pizza." My hands shook. I called the police, feeling desperate, and showed them the messages, photos, and told them about the unexpected pizza delivery. They said they would look into it, but I could tell they weren't taking it seriously. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept all the lights on and stayed awake, afraid to close my eyes. Days went by without any new messages, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Then, a week later, another text came through. "Miss me? I'll be seeing you soon." I reported the new message to the police, providing them with all the information about the delivery driver. They assured me they would investigate further. I also contacted the pizza restaurant, explaining everything that had happened. Within a couple of days, the police confirmed they had identified the sender, and the restaurant informed me the driver had been terminated from their restaurant. It's been months since then, and I haven't received any more messages. Oh, by the way, the police have since mentioned that charges were laid against him for harassment. It's reassuring to know that the legal system is handling it seriously, and there's some form of justice in motion. My cabin sits near the edge of a secluded lake in the Adirondack Mountains, surrounded by thick woods, with the more well-known Lake Placid just a few miles away. It's not entirely isolated, but the closest neighbor is about a mile away, so it feels pretty remote. I moved here for that sense of solitude. I was wanting a fresh start after a rough period. I'd been living there alone for a few months when this happened. It was a typical autumn weekend, and I had no particular plans. I spent most of my time watching YouTube and Netflix and tending to my garden outside. In the late afternoon, while I was sitting on the front porch, I heard something unusual. There was a faint rustling sound coming from the woods at the far end of my property. Curious, I got up from the front porch and quietly walked toward the back of my property to get a better look. As I approached, the movement caught my attention. Someone seemed to be walking through the trees, skirting the edge of my property, heading deeper into the woods. Technically, it was my land, but the direction they were coming from was strange, considering how remote my place is. I watched as the figure slowly made its way along the tree line before eventually disappearing into the forest. I wasn't immediately alarmed by someone being out there, but it was unsettling given the isolation. I continued with my day, occasionally glancing out the window to see if they'd returned, but there was nothing. Later that evening, I settled in to watch a movie in the living room. About halfway through, I began to hear footsteps. They were soft but unmistakable, crunching through the fallen leaves outside. I got up quietly and peeked out of a nearby window. My heart skipped a beat when I saw a man just a few feet from the house. After a moment of shock, I carefully looked again. He seemed completely unaware of me, moving slowly as he walked across my yard. I couldn't be sure, but he looked like the person I had seen earlier. I watched him walk all the way to the far edge of the property and disappear into the trees again. It was one of the most unnerving things I'd ever experienced, especially since he had come so close to the cabin this time. I stayed up later than usual, keeping an eye out in case he returned, and I was ready to call the police if he did. By midnight, there was no further sign of him, so I decided it was safe to go to bed. I went upstairs and fell asleep quickly. Later in the night, I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps outside. I threw on a sweater and hurried downstairs, but by the time I reached the living room, the noise had stopped. I checked every window, but saw nothing. Finally, I approached the front door and looked out through the peephole. There he was, standing in my driveway, staring up at the cabin. It sent a chill down my spine. It was as if he was contemplating his next move. I grabbed my phone and called the police, knowing it would take at least half an hour for them to arrive. When I looked out at the driveway again, he was gone. I then heard the footsteps again, this time circling around to the back of the cabin. I stood still, hoping he would just leave, but then there was a sudden loud noise from the backyard, followed by complete silence. My whole body was trembling as I waited, the quiet stretching on. When the police finally arrived, they began searching the area, calling out to see if anyone would respond. After a tense wait, I found out that he had probably disappeared into the dense woods behind the cabin. Despite their efforts, the police couldn't locate him. The entire situation left me with an unsettling feeling. It still doesn't make any sense to me. After the police left, I double-checked all the locks and barricaded myself in the bedroom, barely sleeping for the rest of the night. Every little noise made me jump. The next morning, I contacted a security company to install cameras and alarms around the property. I've never seen him since. Working the night shift was the only option that fit my life. A small motel off a lonely stretch of US Route 50 in Nevada, where the guests were few and the nights were long. It worked for me, covering the bills. My son was asleep at home, looked after by my husband, while I manned the desk, making sure the hours passed without trouble. The job was straightforward. I kept the books, checked the rare guest in, and waited for dawn. But tonight was different. I wasn't alone. Carlos, my coworker who handled maintenance, was on site doing repairs in the lobby. A little after 3:30 a.m., the front door opened. A man walked in. He was looking disheveled and unsteady. He didn't make eye contact, just mumbled something about needing a room. His clothes were dirty. I handed him the key, and he tossed me some cash on the counter before heading down the hall. There was something about him which didn't sit right with me, but I let it go at the time. Time crawled after that. Carlos and I had gone to the boiler room. He needed a quick hand with something, leaving the lobby unstaffed briefly. After helping him, I returned to the lobby, and I continued doing not much. Then, the basement alarm beeped. I checked the security monitor and could see that the basement door was ever so slightly open. It was supposed to be locked. The man from earlier crossed my mind, but I wasn't sure what to make of it. After the alarm went off, I went to go get Carlos from the boiler room. The basement door being open wasn't something we could ignore. We both knew it should have been locked. Carlos grabbed a flashlight, and we headed down the hall. Carlos pushed the basement door fully open. It was dark in the basement, except for the flashlight beam. Carlos told me to follow him, but to stay close. I was happy to oblige and stay behind. No arguments from me. Inside the basement, we found that the door to a small utility closet was slightly ajar. Its lock had been broken. Inside were some rusted tools and a few old cardboard boxes, but nothing really that interesting. We didn't know what to make of it. I thought that we probably should be calling the police. But before we did, Carlos suggested that we search the basement a bit more thoroughly. There was something off about the situation, and we didn't want to miss anything important. We split up, Carlos checking the far corner, while I stayed searching near the utility closet. Carlos called me over. He'd found another broken lock on a small closet, but it was empty. Dust on the floor showed recent footprints. leading further back into the basement. We continued on, following the trail. The footprints led us to a narrow door next to a cabinet at the back of the basement. I'd never seen this door before. Though, to be fair, I rarely ever went down to the basement. It had always given me the heebie-jeebies. I later learned that the cabinet had been moved to reveal the door. The door was slightly opened. Inside was a large, hidden room, kind of a storeroom, it seemed at the time. Carlos searched the area with his flashlight. Then suddenly a noise came from up ahead. Within the room, in an area that we couldn't see from standing at the doorway. That was it for us, enough exploring. It was time for us to get out, and calling the police was the only option. This was way above our pay grade. Backing out of the basement, we rushed back to the lobby, closing and locking the basement door behind us. I grabbed the phone and dialed the local police. While waiting for the police, I kept my eyes on the security monitor. 10 minutes or so later, the police arrived. I quickly pointed them towards the basement, explaining the open door, the broken locks, and the noises that we heard from below. They asked us a bunch of questions. They, along with Carlos, went down the hall to the basement door, which Carlos unlocked for them. The police continued down the stairs to the basement, while Carlos came back and we watched on the security monitor. It showed them going down the stairs with guns drawn. The coverage from then on was non-existent. As the basement was far away from guests, it had been thought that there was no need for further cameras inside. The police were able to locate the hidden room, and inside there they found the intruder and arrested him. He was apparently crouched by a storage cabinet, trying to pry it open. They grabbed him, cuffed him, and brought him back upstairs. It turned out not to be the guest I checked in earlier, just a local crook who was well known to the police. I felt terrible about thinking that it was the guest, and coming to that conclusion based off of nothing much. The intruder must have snuck in while I was helping Carlos with the boiler. We later learned that there was a safe in the hidden room, which the owner of the motel kept his most valuable possessions. A few years ago now, me and my late husband decided to visit Medellin, Colombia. We'd been hearing a lot about its transformation from a dangerous city to a must-visit destination. Friends who had been there raved about the culture, the food, and how friendly the locals were, despite the city's rough past. We were both curious and wanted to experience it for ourselves. Plus, we needed a break from our hectic work schedules, me with my marketing job and him with his work as a contractor. A bit of adventure in a city with a reputation seemed like the perfect escape to shake things up. We booked an Airbnb that seemed nice and well-reviewed, located just outside the main tourist spots, hoping for a mix of local culture and comfort. We went to Medellin for an adventure. We got more adventure than we bargained for. The decision to stay a bit off the beaten path was partly mine. I wanted a more authentic experience, and the photos online made the place look like a hidden gem. It was a quaint house, modestly furnished but bright and colorful, with a little courtyard where we could have our morning coffee. I liked the idea of staying somewhere that felt more genuine and local, away from the high-rise hotels. My husband was a little more cautious, especially after reading some warnings about the neighborhood online, but he trusted my instincts. When we arrived, it was late in the afternoon. The sun was starting to set. The drive from the airport had been a mix of stunning mountain views and narrow streets lined with graffiti. Our cab driver, an older man with a friendly smile, gave us a few cautious warnings about being out after dark, which made us a bit uneasy. He mentioned some areas to avoid and casually asked if we'd brought much with us, like luggage or valuables. He advised us to stick to the main roads and keep our valuables close. It was a bit unnerving, but we brushed it off. We were here for an adventure after all. The house itself looked welcoming enough, simple, with a small courtyard and colorful walls. Inside, it was basic but clean, just as we'd hoped. As we unpacked, I couldn't shake a strange feeling, something like a gut instinct telling me to be a bit more on edge than usual. But I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on making the most of our stay, despite the slightly unsettling first impressions. Little did we know that unease would soon become justified. The first night was pretty uneventful. After unpacking, we decided to explore a bit and found a small local restaurant nearby. We tried some arepa and bandeja paisa, and it was delicious, exactly the kind of authentic experience we were looking for. After dinner, we walked back to the Airbnb. The place was a little smaller than we'd imagined, but it was clean and had everything we needed. We cracked open a bottle of wine and tried to shake off the stress of the trip. It was nice, just the two of us, a quiet night in a foreign city. By the second night, we'd fallen into a bit of a routine. We'd spent the day wandering around, exploring the local shops and grabbing some street food. By the time we got back to the Airbnb, we were beat. We decided to have an early night, both looking forward to a good sleep. Around midnight, though, I woke up to a noise. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, maybe a dream or something. But then I heard it again. It sounded like a window being pried open. My heart started racing. I nudged my husband, trying not to panic. He mumbled something, half asleep, until he heard the sound too. That got him up real quick. We both sat up, listening, and that's when we heard footsteps inside the house. My husband whispered that I should stay in the bedroom. He grabbed his phone, but before he could do anything, the door creaked open, and a man stepped in. He had a knife in his hand and a look in his eyes that terrified me. He motioned for us to be quiet, waving the knife, and started barking orders in Spanish. I didn't understand everything, but I got the gist. He wanted our stuff, all of it. My husband tried to keep things calm, saying, in his very limited broken Spanish, that we'd give him whatever he wanted. The guy kept waving the knife, getting closer. I fumbled with my bag, pulling out my phone and wallet, placing them on the bed. My husband did the same, keeping his eyes on the guy. The intruder grabbed our stuff, then pointed to the corner where our laptop bag was. We didn't argue. My husband handed over the laptop, and the guy stuffed it into his backpack. He glanced around the room, eyes landing on my jewelry case on the dresser. I didn't have much, a few necklaces and some earrings, but then his eyes landed on my hand, and he pointed at the diamond on my finger. The one thing I hadn't thought to hide, my wedding ring. I hesitated, but he gestured with the knife, and I knew there wasn't a choice. I took off the ring, my hands trembling, and placed it in his hand. He didn't even look at it, just shoved it into his pocket. He took a quick look around, making sure he hadn't missed anything. Then he backed out of the room, still waving the knife, and disappeared down the hallway. We waited, listening to his footsteps fade away, followed by the sound of a window sliding shut. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. We stayed there, frozen, until we were sure he was gone. Neither of us moved, just trying to process what had happened. It wasn't until we heard a car start outside and drive off that we finally felt safe enough to move. Without our phones, we couldn't call for help ourselves. We decided to run to the neighbor's house, hoping they might be home and have a phone we could use. Thankfully, they were home and sympathetic and immediately called the police for us. The officers arrived faster than we expected, given the area. We did our best to explain what had happened, using a mix of our broken Spanish, their broken English, and gestures to get our point across. We knew we couldn't stay there another night, not after what had just happened. As soon as the police left, we packed up our remaining things and decided to move to a hotel in a more secure part of the city. It was a bit of a scramble, but we felt safer knowing we were in a more populated area with better security. Once in the hotel, we contacted both the host and Airbnb immediately. The host had responded quickly, sounding genuinely shocked and very concerned. They were incredibly apologetic and assured us this had never happened before, promising to assist with the refund process. Airbnb agreed to refund us for the remaining nights, and we appreciated the quick response from both the host and the platform. A few days later, we got a call from the local police. They said the thief who had robbed us had been caught red-handed trying to mug someone else. This time, though, he picked the wrong target, an off-duty police officer from New Zealand who was visiting on holiday. The officer overpowered him and detained him until the local police arrived. During questioning, the thief admitted he had a partner, a taxi driver, who would drop off tourists and subtly gather information about their plans and belongings, passing it along to him. It all made sense now. The overly chatty driver who'd insisted on carrying our bags and had asked too many questions about our stay. The police assured us they were working on catching the taxi driver too. Though our stolen items were never recovered, knowing that the thief had been caught was a relief. We were grateful to come out of the ordeal unharmed. We still managed to enjoy the rest of our trip, making the best of a bad situation. I'm a 30-year-old female, and this happened to me 5 years ago. I live in a small apartment in Richmond, which is a suburb close to the central business district in Melbourne, what you might refer to as downtown in America. I had just started a new job and was looking to upgrade my old computer monitor. Not having a lot of money to spend, I turned to Craigslist to find an affordable option. I found a few listings for cheap monitors, but one in particular caught my eye, an old but still functional LCD monitor for a fraction of the cost of a new one. I sent the owner a message and kept looking, but nothing else seemed as promising. The following morning, I got a reply. The owner introduced himself as Patrick and said he'd be happy to show me the monitor whenever I was available. There was something odd about his response. He seemed overly enthusiastic, almost like he was trying too hard. It made me a bit uneasy, but I figured maybe he was just an overly friendly guy. I told him I could come by any day after work at 7, and he suggested I stop by the next evening at 8:30, saying that he'd be back from footy training by then. He told me his address, and that was that. The next day, after work, I went home, chillaxed for a while, then I drove straight to his place. It was well and truly dark out already. I double-checked that I had enough cash on me, and then got out of my car. As I approached the front door, I noticed it was left slightly open. There was no usual fly-wire screen door either, just the main door. Thinking it might have been left open for me, I leaned in to peek inside, but I didn't initially see anyone, so I rang the doorbell. Right after the bell rang, I heard a sound coming from the back of the house. Then silence. The noise made me feel uneasy, and I suddenly got a bad feeling about the whole situation. Just as I was about to turn around and leave, I heard footsteps approaching the door. The door opened a bit wider, and a man appeared in the doorway. He greeted me with a casual "G'day" and asked, in a direct Aussie way, which isn't appropriate for the internets, what I wanted. I replied that I was there to see the monitor, trying to keep my voice steady, and reminded him that we had arranged to meet at 8:30. The man stared at me for a moment, stepped back, and asked me what the bloody hell I was waiting for, and motioned for me to come in. The instant I stepped inside, I felt something wasn't right about it. My gut told me to get the hell out of there, but I hesitated, unsure how to extract myself from the situation. The monitor was right there in the living room, just near to the entrance. He stood right by the door while I went over to have a gander. I told him I'd take it, without giving it a proper once-over, just eager to get out of there. I walked back over to him at the door and handed over the cash. He disappeared into another room for a moment to grab the power cables, then returned and handed me both the cables and the monitor. As I turned to leave, I felt bloody relieved to be getting out of there. When I got back to my flat, I decided to give the monitor a more thorough once-over, just to make sure it was right as rain. As I was having a squiz at the monitor, I stumbled upon something unexpected, a small tile device attached to the back. One of those tracking thingies, like an AirTag. Whoever attached it could see exactly where the monitor was. I felt a surge of fear when it dawned on me. What the hell was going on? The seller had been tracking the monitor, and now they could find out where I lived. The possibilities were terrifying. Robbery, harassment, or worse. As I thought back to the sale, I realized I may not have noticed the tile earlier, since I had only given the monitor a quick once-over. Or maybe the seller had attached it as he passed it to me when I was leaving. I couldn't be sure. So I decided to take it to the police station and report the incident. But as I explained the situation to the cop, I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was overreacting. The cop suggested it was possible the tile was left on by mistake, or that the seller might not have even known it was there. I knew he was right. There was no concrete evidence of any wrongdoing. In the end, they couldn't do anything about it. Before I left, I jokingly offered to donate the monitor to them, mentioning I didn't want to find out what other surprises might be hidden inside. They laughed, but I was dead serious. And just like that, I left it with them, to use or toss, their call. The feeling of being vulnerable lingered, leaving me with more questions than answers. I didn't bother contacting the seller to ask if they knew anything about the tile. I didn't want to imply anything or give them any ideas, in case it was just an honest mistake. I simply wanted to put the whole ordeal behind me and move on, but the nagging sense of unease remained. I decided to take some extra precautions. I looked into getting a dog, but my apartment complex had pet restrictions. Instead, I invested in an alarm system for the flat. It was a small comfort, but it was better than doing nothing. Anyway, I am alive to tell the story. Nothing bad happened, and I never heard from the guy again. No surprise visitors, just a strange and unsettling incident that eventually faded into a distant memory, and into this story for you all. Traveling late at night is usually peaceful, but can often also be eerie. The roads are quiet, and the world feels still. I was on my way back from a weekend trip with my friends, Hannah and Laura. I have changed their names for privacy reasons. We were driving through Dallas, and it was around 11 p.m. The highway was mostly empty, and the only light came from the occasional passing car and the glow of distant city lights. We had been driving for hours, and I really needed to use the restroom. We spotted a McDonald's sign and decided to pull over. As we approached, the familiar golden arches shone brightly, offering a sense of comfort and familiarity, but that feeling wouldn't last for long. The McDonald's was nearly empty, save for a few late-night customers and the staff. Hannah and Laura were starving, so they decided to order some food while I headed straight for the restroom. I was relieved to see the women's restroom was unoccupied. As I entered, the first thing that hit me was the smell. Public restrooms are rarely pleasant, but this one had an overwhelming stench that made me feel sick. I held my breath and quickly checked the stalls. The first two were filthy, but the third one was relatively clean, thankfully. I locked the stall door behind me, took a deep breath, and tried to relax and to not think about the stench. The restroom was eerily silent. As I sat there, an uneasy feeling came over me. I tried to dismiss it as paranoia, but the unease lingered. Just as I was about to finish, I heard the restroom door creak open. I froze, listening intently. Footsteps sounded through the room, but they stopped abruptly. I waited, expecting to hear the sound of a stall door opening or the faucet turning on, but there was nothing. The silence stretched on, and I felt a growing sense of dread. Slowly, I bent down to peek under the stall door, expecting to see someone's feet. Instead, I saw a pair of eyes staring back at me. I was terrified and I shot up, my mind struggling to process what I had just seen. The eyes belonged to a man lying on the bathroom floor, his face pressed against the cold tiles, looking up at me from under the stall. He had a wild, unkempt appearance, with messy hair and a scruffy beard. His eyes were wide and unnerving, with an intensity that made me panic. I screamed and fumbled with the lock, desperate to get out. The man's expression twisted into a disturbing grin as he slowly started to crawl towards me. I burst out of the stall and ran for the door, not daring to look back. My hands trembled as I pushed the door open and stumbled past him and out into the restaurant. Hannah and Laura were at the counter, completely unaware of what had just happened. I rushed over to them, struggling to breathe, but managed to gasp out that there was a man in the ladies' bathroom. They both looked shocked. They quickly called over the staff, who immediately went to check the restroom. Moments later, they returned, saying they couldn't find anyone. The man had vanished. We left McDonald's as quickly as we could, the experience leaving us all unnerved. As we got back into the car, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see those eyes again. It was an encounter I would never forget, and it made me wary of using public restrooms ever again. I bought a house with my college friend, someone I'd known since elementary school. We had been through everything together, sharing secrets, fears, and dreams. The house was 30 minutes from campus, and it was cheaper than renting for 4 years. The place was off-grid, with solar power, a septic system, and well water. We lived miles from the nearest neighbor. Our only rule, give the address to family only. No friends, no partners, no strangers. She knew how cautious I was, especially given past experiences, and agreed to this rule without hesitation. I worried about the wrong person discovering 2 young women living alone in an isolated spot. In our second year, I came home to find her with a stranger on our couch. Furious, I told the guy to leave. My friend was livid, but I stood my ground. I had set boundaries for a reason. After he left, she lashed out, calling me paranoid and claiming occasional visitors posed no threat. I tried to explain, yet again, the risk of strangers knowing our isolated location. Her carelessness made me question everything. I never expected this recklessness from someone I trusted for years. That night, I called my mother and explained the situation. She agreed that my friend's behavior was reckless. I expressed my discomfort, knowing that this stranger now knew our location and that 2 women lived alone here. The house, with photos everywhere, clearly showed our living situation. My friend likely mentioned her single roommate. After all, she had no qualms about bringing a stranger home. Mom offered her place as a temporary refuge, and I decided to attend classes the next day, then pack some things and stay with her for a while. The following afternoon, I returned home to wait for my friend, to tell her that I was going to stay with Mom for a while. As evening approached, I grew tired of waiting and decided to just leave. Bag in hand, I headed for the front door. In the living room, I froze. 2 masked figures stood at our door, visible through the frosted glass. The sound of forced entry filled the house. I heard the intruder's footsteps approaching. In a desperate move, I fumbled for my car keys and pressed the panic button, triggering the car alarm outside. The blaring noise from the opposite side of the house startled the intruders, making them believe someone might be outside or trying to flee. The distraction worked. The intruders went outside to see what was happening. I crept in the opposite direction, towards the kitchen. I grabbed the sharpest knife I could find, hoping that I wouldn't have to use it, but I was ready if one of them came too close for comfort. I was silently making my way upstairs when I heard the intruders return inside. Their voices were clearly angry. I retreated to my room, closing the door softly behind me. I locked the door and quickly jammed my chair against the door handle, knowing it would slow them down if they tried to force their way in. The chair was sturdy, and I hoped it would buy me a few seconds to find a hiding spot. I opened my window to suggest an escape route, just like I had seen in a movie recently. I hoped it would fool them into thinking I had escaped out the window, reinforcing the illusion of my supposed getaway. Then I hid in my closet under old winter ski gear, holding my breath. I heard them searching, complaining about not finding anyone. I muted my phone and quickly messaged my friend, warning her to stay away and to call for help. I sent the same message to my mother. Both of them called back instantly, but thankfully, my phone was on silent, so the noise didn't give away my location. Ignoring the buzzing notifications, I focused entirely on staying hidden as the intruders drew closer to my room. The intruders breached my door. The open window trick worked. They assumed I'd fled on foot. One left the room, but the other remained. He ransacked my belongings, sounding frustrated at the lack of expensive items. I couldn't help but think, sorry to disappoint, I'm not exactly rolling in cash. His footsteps neared the closet. I stayed perfectly still as he opened it. The intruder rummaged through my belongings, and as his hand brushed against the ski gear hiding me, I tightened my grip on the knife, ready to defend myself if I had to. Just then, his partner rushed in, warning of approaching sirens. That distraction might have saved his life as they quickly fled the house, leaving me hidden and unharmed. I stayed hidden until I was sure they had left. Sirens grew closer, and car doors slammed shut outside. The house fell quiet. My mother's voice called from inside. I emerged from my hiding spot and rushed towards her. The intruders were never caught, leaving no evidence behind. The police took statements and looked for clues, but the men had vanished. My friend's visitor from the previous night had an alibi and denied revealing our location to anyone. I decided to move out immediately, no longer feeling safe in the house. I sold my half of the house to a mutual friend of ours, eager to leave the place behind. I was 18 and had recently come out of the closet. It felt liberating to finally be open about who I was. And I had my first girlfriend, Jenna. We were both still living with our parents in San Francisco. One Friday night, we decided to have a date. We both worked part-time, me at a local bakery, and Jenna at a vintage clothing store downtown. It was the end of the week, and with a light load from high school, we finally had some time to spend together. After our shifts, Jenna picked me up in her old sedan, and we went to a small diner not too far from my place. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was cozy, and we were both trying to save money. After dinner, we hung out at her house for a bit, but I wasn't ready for the night to end. I guess I just wanted more time with her. Sensing that, she suggested we go for a drive. We cruised through the city for a while, before heading out toward the quieter roads on the outskirts. San Francisco can be bustling, but once you get past the city limits, it feels like a different world. We ended up on a winding road through a wooded area. There were no streetlights out there, just the car's headlights showing the way. Eventually, the pavement turned to dirt, and Jenna joked about how we should have brought a better car for off-roading. After driving for a while, we found ourselves far from any gas station or fast food place, deep into the woods. The nearest McDonald's or rest stop was at least 20 minutes back. I suddenly felt the urge to take a leak, and Jenna admitted she did too, probably from all the soda we had at the diner. With no gas stations or rest stops in sight, we decided to pull over. As soon as we got out of the car, we heard noises in the trees, like something moving around. I tried to make a joke to lighten the mood, but Jenna looked worried. The sounds put us on edge, so we hurried up and quickly got back to the car. Just as we were about to get in, we heard a loud snap, a branch breaking off to our left. My heart jumped, and I grabbed Jenna's arm. I thought it might be an animal, and I told her we should leave, but then we heard a scream. It was high-pitched, filled with fear or pain. My stomach turned. I told Jenna we needed to go, but she insisted on checking it out. She locked the doors, took her mag light from the glove compartment, and started towards the noise. I was terrified and kept pleading with her not to go, but she felt she needed to make sure no one was in danger. I watched as she moved closer to where we'd heard the scream. Then, another scream. This one much closer. I watched as she aimed her torch ahead into the darkness. Suddenly, she stopped and stared ahead, her face going pale. Without a word, she turned and ran back to the car, jumping in and locking the doors. She immediately started the car and sped off. I kept asking her what happened, but she stayed silent until we were back in the city. Finally, after pulling into a safe, well-lit area, she told me what she saw. There was a man just beyond the torch's reach, completely naked, his body covered in what looked like war paint. She said he was just standing there, completely still, watching us. That sight alone was enough to make her run back to the car. A shiver ran through me as I listened, picturing the scene in my mind. A while back, life took an unexpected turn. Living in Castle Rock, a small but growing town about 30 miles south of Denver, I'd been dealing with persistent, gnawing pain in my lower back that just wouldn't quit. It was the kind of pain that makes you worry something more serious might be going on. After several rounds of doctor visits and a slew of tests, the diagnosis finally came through: polycystic kidney disease. My left kidney was filled with cysts and needed to be removed before things got worse. The urologist in Denver made it sound like a routine fix, nothing to get too worked up about. With Denver being the nearest city with the necessary specialist, it meant regular trips up the highway for consultations and the surgery itself. It wasn't ideal, but it was the closest place that could handle the procedure. The day of the surgery snuck up on me. The hospital was its usual morning chaos. After checking in, they led me to a pre-op room, handed me one of those thin hospital gowns, and had me lie down on a gurney. The nurses were professional and calm, going over the steps of the procedure again, their voices steady and reassuring. I'd never been in for surgery before, and while their reassurances helped a bit, I still felt anxious. The worst part was that, despite my anxiety, I had put my complete trust in the medical professionals, only to find that the trust was misplaced. They started prepping me, drawing blood, hooking up the IV, the whole 9 yards. The anesthesiologist came over with a clipboard, asked me a few last-minute questions, and then administered the anesthesia. The anesthesiologist assured me I'd be out shortly. As he administered the anesthesia, a wave of drowsiness washed over me. My surroundings blurred, and I lost consciousness. When I woke up, I felt confused and in pain. My abdomen was throbbing intensely. I tried to move, but even a slight shift made the pain worse. A nurse noticed I was awake and came over, trying to seem reassuring, but there was tension in her eyes. She said the surgery was over and encouraged me to rest, saying the pain would ease. Her words barely registered. The pain was overwhelming. Deep inside, not just at the incision, I whispered that it hurt a lot. The nurse said pain was normal after surgery, but I saw a hint of doubt in her face. She promised to get the doctor if it didn't get better. As hours went by, the pain grew worse. It wasn't just discomfort. It felt like something was tearing me apart from the inside. I kept hitting the call button, desperate for them to understand something was very wrong. Finally, the surgeon came to see me. His face was calm, but I could see concern in his eyes. He acknowledged my pain, suggesting they run some tests to make sure everything was okay. They took me to get an ultrasound. The technician's face grew serious as she moved the probe over my abdomen, her eyes darting to the screen. She asked me to stay still, her tone suddenly more urgent. Next, they moved me to get an X-ray. Every time the machine shifted, the pain shot through me. I tried to stay still, biting back tears, feeling more terrified with each second. After the X-ray, they took me back to my room to wait. A few hours later, the surgeon returned, looking grim. He said there was news, pausing before explaining they had removed the wrong kidney, my healthy one. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I struggled to understand. How had they removed the wrong kidney? I asked him what he had meant by that. He explained again that the healthy kidney had been removed by mistake. They needed to remove the diseased one now, and I would need dialysis. I asked how they could make such a mistake. The thought of another surgery, knowing my only healthy kidney was long gone, was too much to bear. The surgeon explained there must have been a mix-up in the prep room, and they were looking into it. But for now, their focus was on stabilizing me. I felt overwhelmed. They had taken my only healthy kidney, and now my life was forever changed. I started crying, anger and fear overwhelming me. The next few days were a blur of pain and disbelief. They started me on dialysis right away. The machines did what my body no longer could. The physical pain was intense, but it was nothing compared to the realization that my life would never be the same. I felt trapped, betrayed by the very people who were supposed to help me. The hospital staff tried to be supportive, but I could see the guilt in their faces. They kept saying they were doing everything possible to fix it, but nothing they could say would change what happened. How could they fix this? As I lay in that hospital bed, hooked up to tubes and machines, I kept thinking about what the future would hold. Would I ever get a transplant? Would I be stuck on dialysis forever? The uncertainty was crushing, and I couldn't see a way forward. My life had been turned upside down by a mistake that never should have happened. Since then, however, I've been on dialysis regularly, waiting on the transplant list. A few months ago, I got lucky and received a kidney from a donor. The recovery wasn't easy, but things are starting to stabilize. I still have regular checkups, and my life now revolves around managing my health, but at least I'm not on a machine every day. It's been a long road, but I'm finally seeing some light at the end of the tunnel. It was late on a Wednesday evening, and I was working the night shift at a pizza place in London. My last delivery was to a block of flats in a quiet but run-down neighborhood. The policy was clear. Only the male drivers got sent to this part of town. When I got there, I noticed the building was a bit run down, with a few broken windows and dimly lit hallways. I found the flat number and knocked on the door. A man in his 50s opened the door, wearing a worn-out bathrobe, basically naked. He seemed off, his eyes were bloodshot, and he had a strange, almost desperate look on his face. He took the pizza, but then asked if I could come in for a minute. He claimed his TV was broken and needed help to try and fix it. It was something a strapping young lad, like myself, could fix in my sleep, or some such, he mumbled. I politely declined, saying I had other deliveries to make. As I turned to leave, he grabbed my shoulder tightly, insisting he just needed a minute of my time. I pulled away, repeating that I couldn't stay. His grip tightened, and he started muttering something under his breath, his face inches from mine. I could smell his bad breath. I was that close. I managed to wrench my shoulder free and quickly walked back to the lift. As I waited for the lift, I could hear him following me down the hallway. He was muttering louder now, saying I should stay, that we could have some fun. The lift doors finally opened, and I stepped inside, pressing the button repeatedly to close the doors. He reached the lift just as the doors began to close, and I caught a glimpse of his face, angry, almost manic. The ride down seemed endless. The old man must have taken the second lift right after me. When I finally reached the ground floor, I hurried to my car, glancing over my shoulder. He was there, standing at the top of the stairs, his eyes fixed on me. Just as I got into my car, a group of hooligans drove by, tooting loudly. One of them shouted something about the barely dressed old man. He didn't react, just kept staring at me, which somehow made the situation even creepier. I locked the doors, my heart racing. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I saw him in the rearview mirror, running down the stairs. He darted into the street, trying to catch up to my car. I accelerated, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. I heard a loud thud on the back of the car, like he had thrown something. I didn't stop to look. I kept driving, glancing back only when I reached the main road. A few blocks away, I pulled into a petrol station to catch my breath. I decided to check the car for any damage. After I stepped out, I noticed a small dent on the rear bumper. I hadn't realized it earlier, but it looked like something had hit the car. Sometime later, when I reviewed the footage from my rear dash cam, I saw the old man hurling a brick at my car as I sped away. I immediately drove back to the pizzeria and explained to my manager what had happened, telling him we needed to involve the police. The police arrived 15 minutes after, took a look at the dash cam footage, and noted the damage to the car. They said they'd investigate the incident. I finished my shift, but I couldn't shake off what had happened. I was staying at my sister's new house in the quiet neighborhood of Alameda, just outside of Portland, Oregon, while she was away on a business trip. She had just moved to the area, and her house was a lot nicer than my apartment, so I was happy to help out. The neighborhood was known for its peaceful streets and well-kept lawns, making it a popular spot for young professionals. My sister's house was cozy, with a small garden in the backyard and a driveway where she parked her car. I didn't have much to do besides keep an eye on the place and make sure her pet cat was fed. The first few days went by smoothly. It almost felt like a mini vacation until I noticed my sister's cat had gone missing, which started to unsettle me. I spent lots of time searching around the house and the neighborhood, calling out for the cat, but there was no sign of her anywhere. One evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through my phone on a local Facebook page for missing pets, hoping someone might have seen the cat, when I heard a strange scraping sound coming from outside. It was faint, but it sounded like something metal was being dragged along the side of the house. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I immediately got up and turned on the outdoor lights. I walked over to the window and cautiously peered outside. The yard was empty, but when I stepped out to check, I noticed strange marks on the siding, like someone had dragged a metal tool along it. The thought of someone lurking outside made me feel uneasy, but I convinced myself it was probably just some kids messing around. The next morning, I noticed something even more unsettling. My sister's cat, who had been missing for a couple of days, was lying in the backyard. But something was wrong. The poor thing wasn't moving. I rushed over, hoping it was just asleep, but as I got closer, I realized the cat was dead. There were signs that it hadn't died of natural causes. I don't want to go into the specifics. They were way too gruesome. It was just lying there, like someone had placed it on purpose. The discovery made me feel sick with anger. I started to wonder if the strange noises the night before were connected to this. Alameda was supposed to be safe, so this made me even more paranoid. Later that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard footsteps outside. They were slow and steady, moving around outside the house. My heart raced as I listened, trying to figure out where the person was. Then I heard a loud crash, the sound of glass shattering. I ran to the window and saw a masked figure standing in the driveway, holding a crowbar. The person had turned their attention to my sister's car. I watched in horror as the intruder began smashing the car's windows, headlights, and body with the crowbar. The noise of smashing metal and glass filled the air, and I stood there, too terrified to move. The intruder seemed completely focused on the car, as if they had a vendetta against it. After what felt like an eternity, they finally stopped, dropped the crowbar, and ran off down the road, yelling and screaming like a lunatic. I had called the police as soon as I saw the intruder smashing the car. It was the second time that day that I had to call them, and they arrived quickly. But by then, the damage was already done, and the intruder was gone. My sister's car was a complete wreck. Every window had been shattered, the body dented, and the headlights smashed. The police took my statement and suggested it might have been targeted vandalism, but they couldn't say for sure. The discovery of the dead cat that morning only made everything feel even more disturbing. My sister was devastated, first losing her pet, and now facing this attack on her property. Alameda, once quiet, now felt anything but safe. We both felt violated, knowing that someone had gone out of their way to do this, and we couldn't help but wonder if it might happen again. To this day, we don't know who did it or why, and that uncertainty is the worst part. The only thing we know for sure is that whoever it was, they didn't care about being seen, and they were confident enough to destroy everything in their path. The apartment building in Albany, New York, was quiet most nights. I worked the night shift job, and the routine was familiar. Check IDs, sort mail, watch security feeds. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills after a cross-country move following a breakup. At 2 a.m., the lobby intercom buzzed. The security monitor showed an unfamiliar man in a dark cap at the door. He buzzed again, more insistent. I asked for his name and who he was visiting. The man claimed he was there to see a friend, but wouldn't provide details. When entry was denied, his demeanor changed instantly. He began pacing in front of the door, demanding to be let in. The situation escalated quickly. The man pulled out a gun, visible on the security feed. I called the police while keeping an eye on the monitor. The man outside grew more agitated, pacing faster and glaring at the camera. I was scared beepless. I waited for the police to arrive. Every sound in the lobby seemed amplified. The man kicked the glass door repeatedly. His eyes looked wild, unfocused. He seemed drunk or high, making him even more unpredictable. He disappeared from view momentarily. The camera feed showed him at a nearby dumpster. He returned with a metal pipe, brandishing it alongside the gun.
"Let me in."
His muffled scream came through the door. He started smashing the pipe against the card reader. Sparks flew everywhere. The reader flickered, then momentarily went dark. If damaged enough, the door might unlock automatically, I guessed. Thankfully, it was able to take the punishment dished out. I called the police again and urged them to hurry the F up. The man alternated between attacking the locking mechanism and pacing, muttering to himself. He pressed his face against the glass. His bloodshot eyes settled on the security camera. He pointed the gun directly at the lens, smiling. I could hear sirens in the distance, and I assume he did too, because suddenly he stopped. Then he stared directly into the lens and gave me the one-finger salute before briskly walking out of view. Switching between camera feeds showed him exiting through the parking garage, disappearing into the darkness. When the police finally arrived, a couple of officers entered the lobby. They asked for details about the incident. I showed them the security footage. They took notes, radioed a description of the man to other units in the area. One officer stayed in the lobby while the others searched the building and surrounding area. The wait felt endless. The officer returned with no sign of the intruder. They promised me that they would increase patrols in the area for the rest of the night. As they left, the lobby felt emptier, and I felt more vulnerable. I called the building manager to report the incident. He sounded groggy and annoyed at being woken up. He said he'd come by in the morning to review the footage. He really didn't seem to grasp the seriousness of the situation. The rest of the shift crawled by. The gun the man had brandished kept replaying in my mind. What if he came back? What if next time he got inside? At 4 a.m., a tenant came home late. I nearly jumped out of the chair at the sound of the door opening. The tenant noticed the tension, and he asked if everything was okay. I gave a vague answer about a disturbance earlier. I didn't want to cause a panic. 5 a.m. brought the usual early risers. A few people heading out for work or early morning jogs. I watched each one carefully on the monitors as they exited the building. The fear of the gunman returning hadn't subsided. One of the early morning tenants mentioned seeing a suspicious car in the parking lot. I checked the cameras immediately, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Was the man still out there, watching and waiting? At 6 a.m., I thought I saw movement on one of the exterior cameras. My heart stopped for a moment. It turned out to be a stray cat. The adrenaline rush left my hands shaking. 6:30 a.m., the morning shift finally arrived. Gave them a rundown of the night's events. They looked concerned, but not overly worried. It wasn't their shift that had been threatened. The night's events felt almost unreal, but the police report and the security footage were stark reminders. It had happened. The man with the gun had been there. Thankfully, he never did come back. When I was fresh out of high school, I took a job working the night shift at a McDonald's. As a young woman, I spent about a year at Macca's, what we call McDonald's here in Australia. Although it might sound like a typical fast food gig, those late night shifts were anything but ordinary. The quiet hours often felt eerie, a stark contrast to the bright, cheerful decor. During the day, Macca's was lively and crowded, filled with families and children. But at night, it transformed into an almost entirely different place, where odd things seemed to happen more frequently. One experience in particular still gives me the creeps whenever I think about it. It was a few months into my job, during one of those late-night shifts. It was around 11 p.m., a relatively slow time, with only a few customers coming through the drive-thru or grabbing a quick bite. I was stationed at the front counter, trying to keep myself occupied between orders by cleaning surfaces and restocking the sauces and supplies. While I was tidying up, a man who looked to be in his late 40s walked in. I assumed he would place an order, but instead, he walked up to the counter with a strange grin and asked,
Would you like to hang out sometime?
The question took me by surprise. The restaurant was nearly deserted, and his tone felt intrusive in the quiet of the night. Feeling uneasy, I politely declined and asked if he wanted to order anything. He ignored my question and left without ordering. I tried to dismiss the unease, thinking it was probably just another odd encounter. However, an hour later, while cleaning tables, I saw him outside, hovering near the car park entrance, watching me. I felt scared but focused on my tasks, avoiding eye contact. Around 1 a.m., when things had finally quietened down, I took a short break in the back. When I returned to the front, there he was again. He had come back inside. He approached the counter with a strange, almost apologetic look, and said he was sorry for his earlier behavior, claiming he was just having a bad night. I nodded, hoping that would be the end of it. But then he asked again if we could spend some time together. I firmly declined, telling him I wasn't interested. His expression shifted from apologetic to angry.
Can't you just make an exception, just this once?
He insisted. I felt a surge of fear and responded, "I have a boyfriend. I don't think that's a good idea." He muttered something under his breath that I couldn't make out, and stormed out, letting the door slam shut behind him. For the rest of my shift, I couldn't help but feel that he might still be lurking around. I kept glancing at the entrance, worried he might come back in. Thankfully, the remainder of the night was uneventful, and I was able to finish my shift. As my shift was coming to an end around 3 a.m., I waited inside by the door for my dad to pick me up. The car park was dark and deserted, adding to my sense of unease. When I finally saw my dad's car pulling in, I felt a ton of relief. But as I stepped outside, I suddenly heard fast footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw the same man from earlier, coming toward me with a determined look on his face. Fear gripped me, and I hurried toward my dad's car, fumbling with the door handle in my panic. Just as I managed to get the door open and climb inside, the man reached us. He started banging on the car window, shouting something I couldn't understand. My heart was racing as my dad quickly drove away, speeding out of the car park. From the passenger seat, I called the police and explained what had happened. I was relieved to be safe and never saw that man again. But I've been much more cautious ever since, especially during those late shifts. I manage a rental business through the popular short-term rentals app, Airbnb, here in Canada, focusing on properties in the outskirts of Vancouver. I handle the day-to-day operations, everything from maintenance to guest communications, while my partner provides the financial support. We've got a handful of properties, but our most popular is a cozy cabin nestled in a quiet, forested area just outside the city. It's the kind of place people book when they want to escape the hustle and bustle for a while. Our business peaks in the summer and winter months, when everyone seems to want either a summer getaway or a winter retreat. But in the fall, things slow down. So, when we received a month-long booking for the cabin last October, it was a welcome surprise. We didn't know much about the guests, just that a woman named Julia had made the booking. She handled all the payments and correspondence, and that was fine with us. Less hassle, we thought. During their stay, we didn't hear a peep from them, not a single call or message. I reached out halfway through to see if everything was okay, and Julia simply texted back, "All good." I took that as a sign that they were happy and didn't think much more about it. It was a refreshing change from the usual guests who always seemed to have a new request or complaint every day. When the month was up, I headed over to the cabin to check things out. Normally, we expect a little mess, maybe some dishes left out, or a trash bag not taken out. But this time, something was off. As soon as I stepped inside, a strong, unfamiliar smell hit me. Something musty, like damp wood, with a faint hint of smoke. Then I noticed a low, constant hum coming from the living room. I walked over and saw that the space heater had been left on, running at full blast, even though it was unseasonably warm for this time of year in Vancouver. I turned it off and continued further inside. The smell seemed to get stronger, almost overpowering. It was clear that someone had left in a hurry. As I moved through the cabin, I noticed drawers pulled open, belongings scattered on the floor, and a few broken items here and there. The living room was a mess. Broken dishes, a flipped-over table, and the couch cushions thrown around. It looked like someone had ransacked the place, searching for something, or maybe trying to cover their tracks. I had no idea at that time, just what had gone down. I took a deep breath and headed towards the bedroom, bracing myself for what I might find. The sight was unsettling. The sheets were torn off the bed, stained with dark, unidentifiable spots. Empty wine bottles, porn magazines, and a vibrator and other adult items were scattered on the floor, and the air was thick with a foul smell. I could barely breathe. I heard faint sounds coming from the walk-in closet. I hesitated, fearing what might be inside. Slowly, I pulled the door open and saw something slumped at the bottom. A large, lumpy shape covered in a dark, sticky substance. I slammed the door shut immediately, my mind refusing to accept what I'd just seen. I tried to convince myself it was just a pile of discarded clothes or something harmless. But curiosity, or maybe sheer disbelief, drove me to open the door again. This time I got a better look, and there was no mistaking it. It was a body. The face was so battered it was almost unrecognizable. Blood was everywhere, fresh enough that it hadn't yet dried completely. Panicking, I pulled out my phone and dialed emergency services, explaining in a rushed voice that I'd found a body. They asked me to check for a pulse. I didn't want to go near her, but I knew I had to. As I leaned over, I hesitated, trying to remember where to check for a pulse. My mind was racing. I found her pulse. She was alive, but only barely. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. I informed the dispatcher that she was still alive, but her pulse was faint. The dispatcher requested that I verify the front door was unlocked to ensure the paramedics could enter without delay. Next, the dispatcher asked if I knew how to perform CPR, and if I could start it immediately to help keep her alive until the paramedics arrived. I hesitated, recalling a half-day first aid course I had taken years ago as part of a workplace safety requirement. The memory of those few hours of training seemed distant and inadequate, and I wasn't confident that I could remember the proper techniques. The dispatcher sensed my uncertainty. She offered to guide me through the process, step by step, to help me administer CPR correctly. With her reassurance and instructions, I began the chest compressions and rescue breaths, hoping to keep her alive until the paramedics arrived. Thankfully, the paramedics arrived soon after, while I was still administering CPR to Julia, with the dispatcher still on the line. They quickly took over, relieving me as they assessed the situation and began to stabilize Julia. They carried her out on a stretcher, and I was left shaken but relieved that help had arrived. The police arrived shortly after, and I was told to stay out of the cabin while they conducted their investigation. They asked me all sorts of questions about the guests, but I knew little beyond Julia's name and the booking details. Only later did I find out that Julia had been the sole guest all along. The police seemed particularly interested in the disarray inside, especially the scattered belongings and the signs of a struggle. A few weeks later, an officer called me to explain what had happened. Julia had been using the cabin as a combined vacation and workspace, filming content for her OnlyFans account in the secluded location. But Julia had made a critical mistake. She'd told a local fan that she was in the area. The fan had been able to identify the cabin's location from photos and showed up uninvited. The situation then quickly spiraled out of control, and that's when shit hit the fan, pun intended, leading to the violent confrontation that left Julia badly injured. My husband and I were renovating our farmhouse, and we had decided to sell the old barn door on Craigslist, as it no longer fitted with our plans, but my husband was at work that day. A buyer had expressed interest, and normally I wouldn't invite a stranger to our home, but this was a large, heavy door that I couldn't easily move. I had no choice but to let the buyer come to me. We agreed to meet at the farmhouse at 2 p.m., and I waited nervously for their arrival. At 1:45 p.m., there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find a man standing there with his truck parked in the driveway. He said he was there to buy the barn door and admitted to being early. I told him to wait while I went to unlock the barn. As I walked back, I noticed he was lingering around the farmhouse, taking in the surroundings. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I pushed it aside. When I showed him the barn door, he seemed satisfied, but then offered a lower price than we had agreed on. I declined, and he walked back to his truck, saying he'd think about it. A couple of hours later, I noticed a truck parked down the road, near the edge of our property. It looked just like his, a common make and model, but I couldn't see the license plate from where I was standing. I convinced myself it was just a coincidence. There were many farms and ranches in the area, and trucks were a staple around here. Maybe it belonged to a neighbor or a delivery person. I didn't give it much thought, assuming it had nothing to do with the earlier visitor. But then, someone knocked on our door, catching me off guard since I wasn't expecting any visitors. My husband wasn't due home for hours. I cautiously approached the door and looked through the peephole. It was the man from earlier, holding a large wad of cash and looking friendly and apologetic. He yelled through the door that he was willing to pay the full price for the barn door and wanted to make the purchase. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to open the door. As soon as I opened it, he shoved his way inside, catching me off guard. Before I could react, he pushed me to the ground, ordering me to stay put and threatening that if I moved, things would end badly. I hit the floor hard, my head spinning, feeling utterly helpless. He grabbed my phone and wallet from the coffee table and shoved them into his pocket. Then he walked over to the front door, locked it, and removed the key from the lock. Afterwards, he methodically searched the closet, scattering storage bins and linens until he found something to tie me up with, my sewing measuring tape. He returned to where I lay and began to tie my hands behind my back, telling me to shut up as I tried to speak and plead with him to stop. He demanded to know where the valuables were, but I was too terrified to answer. He tore through my belongings, searching for anything he could find. As he rummaged, I noticed his frantic, jerky movements and the sweat dripping from his brow. his eyes looking around wildly, and it struck me that he might be high on something. I hadn't noticed it before. I was too paralyzed by fear. He moved closer, pressing the knife against my throat. He demanded to know where I kept my jewelry. I tried to explain there was nothing else of value. For the next hour, he tore through our house, overturning furniture, ripping open drawers, and shattering anything in his way. He smashed picture frames, dumped out closets, and tossed everything he could find. I stayed on the floor, hands tied, heart pounding, watching in fear as he destroyed our home, desperate to find something else worth taking. He picked the wrong house, as we really had nothing worth stealing. He came back towards me, the knife now clamped between his teeth. He started to unzip his jeans. His wild eyes locked onto me. I then realized with horror that he planned to assault me. My heart pounded as I braced myself for the unimaginable. Then, the sound of a car pulling up outside startled him. He quickly rushed to go look out the window. I was praying that it was my husband, though he wasn't due home yet. He must have noticed something or someone that worried him. The man told me not to call the police, saying he'd be long gone. Then, without another word, he escaped out the back door, leaving me tied up on the floor. Seconds after he left, my husband unlocked the door and rushed in, his face immediately registering shock at the sight of me on the floor, tied up, and the overturned furniture and broken items around me. He quickly untied my hands and helped me sit up. While he checked me over for injuries, he asked what had happened. I quickly explained about the intruder, everything that had transpired, and that the intruder had just left. He grabbed the largest kitchen knife we had and immediately rushed out the back door, hoping to catch the intruder. By the time he got outside, the intruder's truck was already gone. While my husband was busy being my hero, I called the police, who arrived shortly after. They took statements from both of us, noting every detail we could remember. The crime scene unit came and dusted for fingerprints, taking a few items the intruder had touched as evidence. They assured us they would do their best to track him down, but I didn't feel much hope. It was pure luck that my husband came home from work a few hours earlier than usual that day. If he hadn't, I shudder to think what might have happened. His unexpected arrival was the only reason the intruder didn't have more time to do what he came here to do. We spent the night at a friend's house, too shaken to stay in our own home. The police kept in touch, but weeks passed with no further news. The emergency call came at 3 a.m. 5 hikers were missing. Strange animal attacks had been reported in the Great Smoky Mountains. I quickly assembled my team: Clifton, our leader, Hillary, our biologist, and Denali, our tracker. We left for the remote forest at dawn. We arrived at the ranger station by midday. The local rangers showed us photos of destroyed campsites and unusual claw marks on trees. They reported increased wildlife aggression in the past month. Clifton immediately began planning our search grid while Hillary examined the evidence. Denali started scouting the area, noting disturbed vegetation and odd tracks. I checked our gear and communication devices, ensuring everything was operational. The situation was clearly more severe than we'd initially thought. We needed to move quickly to prevent further incidents. We entered the forest at first light. Denali led, following a faint trail of broken twigs and disturbed soil. Hillary collected samples from shredded tents and strange animal droppings. Clifton kept us moving at a brisk pace, eyes scanning the tree line. By midday, we reached a small clearing. The ground was torn up, with deep gouges in the earth. Hillary knelt to examine what looked like a partial footprint. It was massive, unlike anything we'd seen before. Denali's face tightened as he circled the area, noting how the tracks suddenly vanished. Clifton ordered us to set up a temporary base camp. As we worked, I couldn't help but feel we were being watched. The forest had gone eerily quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals, just an oppressive silence that seemed to close in around us. We needed answers, and fast. Night fell quickly. We took turns on watch, scanning the darkness with night vision goggles. At 2 a.m., Denali shook me awake. He'd heard something large moving through the underbrush. We woke the others, and we killed the lights. The creature burst into our camp with shocking speed. In the green glow of my goggles, I glimpsed a massive, fur-covered form. It swiped at Clifton, who barely dodged. Hillary looked for her tranquilizer gun. I fired a warning shot, which seemed to confuse the beast. It hesitated, then vanished into the trees. It wasn't just an animal. It was calculating, the way it moved, the way it watched us from the shadows. This wasn't a mindless predator. It was hunting us with intent. We spent the rest of the night on high alert. At first light, we examined the campsite. Deep claw marks scored the trees. A half-eaten deer carcass lay nearby, confirming the creature's predatory nature. Hillary collected fur samples while Denali studied the tracks. The footprints were unlike anything in our database, a mix of bear and primate characteristics, but much larger than either. Clifton decided we needed to track the creature to its lair. Denali took point, following the trail of broken branches and disturbed earth. The forest became thicker, and the air was stale. We found more evidence of the creature's presence. Claw-marked trees, bones, and patches of coarse fur caught on thorny bushes. After hours of trekking, we reached a steep ravine. The creature's tracks led straight down. As we descended, rocks shifted and tumbled beneath our feet. Suddenly, Hillary lost her footing. She slid down the slope, barely catching herself before a sheer drop-off. We helped her up. All of us were shaken by the close call. At the bottom of the ravine, we discovered a cave entrance, partially hidden by overgrowth. A pungent smell wafted out. Clifton signaled for silence as we approached. Inside, we found piles of bones and tattered clothing, clear evidence of the missing hiker's fate, but the creature was nowhere in sight. We set up camp near the cave entrance, planning to ambush the creature when it returned. Night fell quickly. Around midnight, a low growl alerted us to the creature's approach. It moved faster than we anticipated, charging into our camp before we could react. Hillary attempted to subdue it with a tranquilizer, but missed in the chaos. The creature knocked her aside effortlessly. I fired my weapon, but the shots seemed to have little effect. In the confusion, Hillary and Denali retreated towards the trees. I followed, realizing we were far outmatched. We weren't dealing with any ordinary predator. Even Denali, who had tracked everything from wolves to bears, looked shaken. The usual tricks weren't going to work here. We ran through the dark forest, the creature's heavy footsteps close behind. After what seemed like an eternity, we stumbled upon an old ranger's cabin. We barricaded ourselves inside, catching our breath. In the chaos of the escape, Clifton had been separated from us, and we hadn't seen him since. We were disoriented and worried about his fate. As we started to assess our situation, a low hum came from our comms gear. The creature must have hit the equipment during the attack. Our radios were dead, and the backup batteries were fried. Our supplies were gone, and we were trapped with a deadly predator outside. As morning broke, a faint voice could be heard coming from outside the cabin. It was Clifton. We cautiously opened the door, still on high alert, wary of a possible trap, but it was just him, limping and bloodied. He'd managed to evade the creature by hiding in the dense underbrush, but had taken a bad fall in the process. We quickly let him in and re-secured the cabin, relieved but also painfully aware of how close we all were to not making it out. Clifton suggested we use the cabin's sturdy structure to our advantage. We devised a plan to lure the creature inside and trap it. Denali rigged a makeshift pulley system with ropes from the cabin's supplies. I positioned myself as bait near the entrance while Hillary and Clifton prepared to slam the door shut. We waited in tense silence for hours. Near dusk, we heard heavy footsteps approaching. The creature appeared in the doorway, its massive form blocking out the fading light. I backed away slowly, drawing it inside. As it lunged forward, I dove to the side. We knew the net wouldn't hold it for long, but we were counting on those few seconds, just enough time to get a shot off, maybe wound it, maybe slow it down. Clifton slammed the door shut as Denali activated the pulley, dropping the heavy net onto the beast. But the creature's strength was overwhelming. It tore through the net almost instantly, sending splintered wood and tangled ropes flying as it broke free. Hillary fired the tranquilizer gun, but the dart missed in the chaos. The beast charged, knocking down the cabin door. I felt its claws brush my arm as I dove out of the way. A close call that left me with a burning slash, but still on my feet. We scattered, the others narrowly evading its massive claws as it swiped at us. Denali threw a flare, momentarily blinding the creature. We used this distraction to escape into the forest. Behind us, we heard the creature's roars fading as it retreated in the opposite direction. Once we were sure we were out of immediate danger, we made our way to the nearest operational ranger station. Exhausted and shaken, we reported the encounter. Our evidence was gone, lost in the flight from the cabin. We'd seen it with our own eyes, but to them, it was just another wild animal attack. With no solid evidence, just our word, it was easier for them to brush it off than to face what we knew was out there. As we prepared to leave, we heard distant howls echoing through the forest. The creature is still out there, its existence known only to us, and now you too. I was living in Carson City, Nevada, back in the day when this happened. I'm a night owl, which is why I thought picking up the occasional night shift at McDonald's wouldn't be too bad, even though I usually worked at McDonald's during the day. It's quieter at night, with fewer customers, and from what I'd heard, the night manager, Martin, was a laid-back kind of guy. But nothing could prepare me for what was about to happen. It was a Friday night, around 8 p.m. I think, when I got a call from Martin. One of the night shift workers had called in sick, and he needed someone to cover for him. Reluctantly, I agreed, got changed, and headed out. By the time I arrived, the place was slammed with customers. I clocked in and got to work, handling orders at the front counter and the drive-thru. By around 10:30, things had quieted down. The previous shift leader wished me luck and left. leaving just the night crew to handle the shift. I was manning the drive-thru and front counter, trying to keep up with the flow of customers. It wasn't my first time juggling multiple tasks, but it was my first overnight shift at this McDonald's, and I was nervous. The headsets we used would chime with a pixelated bell sound whenever a car pulled into the drive-thru, and it could get annoying fast. That night, it seemed louder than usual. Around midnight, the bell chimed. I greeted the customer with my usual line, "Hi, welcome to McDonald's," but all I heard in return was static. I waited a moment, then asked again. Nothing but white noise. This wasn't entirely uncommon. Sometimes, the sensor would get triggered by someone walking by or a car driving around the building. After a few minutes, the static stopped, and I relaxed, but not for long. The bell chimed again. I repeated my greeting, and again, no response. This time, the static persisted longer. I could have sworn I heard heavy breathing mixed in with the static, but I told myself it was just my imagination. After 10 minutes of this, the static finally stopped. I was on edge, but tried to distract myself by cleaning already spotless counters. The restaurant was fairly empty. Then, the bell chimed once more. Before I could say my greeting, a loud, blood-curdling scream pierced through the headset. I yanked it off. My heart was pounding. What the hell was that? I thought to myself. Shakily, I put the headset back on, determined to catch whoever was messing with me. I ran out to the drive-thru menu, expecting to find some prankster, but there was no one there. The static was still coming through my headset, though. I took a deep breath and tried to steady my nerves. There had to be a logical explanation for what was happening. Maybe the headset was malfunctioning, or maybe it really was just someone messing with me. I decided to keep an eye on the drive-thru, hoping the strange occurrences would stop. The rest of the night was uneventful until around 1:30 a.m. I was standing near the drive-thru window, trying to stay awake, when I felt a sudden rush of cold air on my arm. The window was slightly open, which was odd because I hadn't touched it. I closed it and went back to my spot, but the unsettling feeling lingered. A few minutes later, the bell chimed again. My heart raced as I put the headset back on. "Hi, welcome to McDonald's," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. This time, there was no static. Instead, I heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound. It was like someone was trying to speak, but couldn't. I decided I had to see for myself what was going on. I walked outside to the drive-thru menu, shining my flashlight around. The parking lot was empty, and there was no sign of anyone. Just as I was about to go back inside, I heard a noise behind me. It was the sound of footsteps on gravel. But when I turned around, no one was there. I quickly went back inside, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking, and I have to admit, I was scared shitless. Martin noticed my distress and asked if I was okay. I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I just told him it was a long night and I was feeling tired. He nodded and went back to his work. I spent the next hour trying to focus on my tasks, but my mind kept drifting back to the strange events. I decided to check the security cameras, hoping they might show something that would make sense of the situation. As I watched the footage, I saw something that filled me with fear. There, on the screen, was a dark figure standing near the drive-thru menu. It was barely visible, just a shadow in the corner of the camera's view, but it was definitely there. and then, just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. I rewound the footage and watched it again, but the figure didn't reappear. I showed the video to Martin, but he just shrugged it off, saying it was probably a trick of the light or a glitch in the camera. The rest of the night dragged on. Every time the bell chimed, I jumped, expecting to hear that scream again, but nothing happened. Finally, my shift ended, and I was relieved to clock out and head home. The next night, I was scheduled to work again. I almost called in sick, but I didn't want to let Martin down, especially since he was already short-staffed. I also didn't want to seem like I was overreacting. I told myself it was just a series of strange coincidences and that I'd get through the shift without any issues. The evening started quietly. There were a few customers, but nothing out of the ordinary. As the night wore on, I found myself constantly glancing at the drive-through window, half expecting something to happen. Midnight came and went without incident, and I started to relax, thinking maybe the previous night had just been a fluke. But then, around 2 a.m., the bell chimed again. I greeted the customer, but once more, there was only static. My heart started racing, but I forced myself to stay calm. I repeated my greeting, but the static continued. Then, I heard it again, the heavy breathing. It was clearer, almost as if the person was standing right next to me. A little while later, I was restocking supplies in the kitchen when I heard a noise behind me. I turned around and saw the drive-through window slightly open again. This time, I knew I had closed it securely. I walked over, closed it again, and made sure it was locked. I went to find Martin, who was still at his desk, oblivious to what was happening. I told him about the slightly open drive-through window, but he dismissed it, saying it was probably left that way. I wanted to believe him, but I knew deep down that wasn't the case. The remainder of the night passed slowly. I kept my distance from the drive-through window and stayed in the well-lit areas of the restaurant. Finally, my shift ended, and I left the restaurant, never working the night shift again. I left behind the blistering heat of Death Valley to start anew in the sub-zero chill of Alaska's interior. It was a move that would prove to be the most drastic change of my life, and the most terrifying. I was searching for a fresh start, something different, something that would challenge me. The town was tiny, with just a few hundred residents. Winters here were brutal. After a few days, I realized getting around would be tough without the right gear. I needed something to handle the snow and ice, something rugged. That's when I stumbled upon Clyde's ad on Craigslist. It was for a snowmobile, the kind that looked like it could handle anything the harsh backcountry could throw at it. I contacted Clyde through the ad. He responded quickly and seemed eager to sell. He mentioned he'd lived in the area for decades and that the snowmobile had served him well. He explained he didn't use it much anymore, slowing down with age. I told him I was interested, and we arranged to meet the next day. Clyde's cabin was on the outskirts, a good few miles from town. He told me to follow the main road until it ended, and then take a narrow path leading into the woods. "Can't miss it," he'd said. And he wasn't wrong. It was the only place around, ironically looking like it belonged in a horror movie, with its sagging roof, cracked windows, and an old, rusted-through pickup parked out front. I probably should have turned around right then, but alas, I didn't. I had set out early that morning, knowing the daylight hours were short this time of year. The drive was long, and the snow-covered road seemed to stretch forever, leading me to this isolated cabin. I parked and texted Clyde, letting him know I'd arrived. He replied quickly, telling me to come right up and meet him in the garage where the snowmobile was. I stepped out of the car, shivering in the cold. I wasn't used to these harsh conditions, having only been here a few days. The garage was a little ways from the cabin, hidden behind a thick cluster of trees. As I walked, an unsettling feeling crept over me. But I brushed it off and kept going. I was here to get a snowmobile. I reached the garage. It was larger than I expected. It was more like a hangar than a regular garage, spacious enough to store a snowmobile, some heavy equipment, and even a small plane. The door was partially open. I pushed it fully open and stepped inside. The snowmobile was right there, all right, but Clyde wasn't. I called out, but there was no answer. I looked around, trying to spot any sign of him, but it was pitch dark inside, with no internal light source to help. While waiting for Clyde, I started to examine the snowmobile. It was parked right near the door, with just enough light from outside to illuminate it. I turned on my phone's torch to see better, inspecting the engine and controls. Then, suddenly, the garage door slammed shut behind me. I turned quickly, my heart racing. The door's closure cut off the little light from outside, leaving me with just the dim beam from my phone's torch in the now pitch-black space. I texted Clyde, asking what was going on. No response. I tried the door, but it was locked tight. Panic set in as I realized something was very wrong. I heard a shuffling noise, followed by a low mutter. I looked around, but my flashlight didn't catch anything unusual. My mind was racing. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but the only answer was silence. I backed up, pressing against the wall. My mind was screaming to get out, but I was trapped. I noticed a door on the far side of the garage, partially hidden behind some old crates. I ran towards the door, hoping it would lead me outside. But about halfway to the door, something snapped around my ankle. A hunter's trap. I felt the most excruciating pain I had ever felt, shooting up my leg. A man emerged from a dim corner, his face hidden behind a ski mask. He'd been standing there all along, just out of sight. He told me to stop struggling, saying it wouldn't help. But I couldn't help it. Adrenaline surged as I fought to free myself from the trap. My phone slipped from my hand, falling to the ground. The man laughed, the most evil laugh you could imagine. I managed to pry the trap open just enough to pull my foot free. Pain shot through my leg, and I could feel blood starting to pool around my ankle. But I ignored it. I grabbed my phone and sprinted, as best I could anyway, toward the small door at the back, hoping it would be unlocked and lead to freedom. The man lunged at me, but I managed to dodge, and thankfully was able to burst through the door into the freezing night. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him chasing me on the snowmobile. My breath fogged up the windshield, and I realized I was hyperventilating. I had to pull myself together. I called the police as soon as I felt safe to do so. Their response time wasn't the greatest. About 4 hours later, they informed me they had been to investigate, but the cabin was empty. Clyde, or whoever he was, had vanished. Inside the garage, they discovered a makeshift pulley system, a simple setup of ropes and weights rigged to pull the door shut from a distance. That explained how Clyde closed the door behind me from the other end of the garage. The place was otherwise empty except for the snowmobile, the trap, and an assortment of crates and other pieces of junk. No sign of the man, no clues left behind. I later found out the cabin had been abandoned for years. Whoever set up the Craigslist ad seemed to want to lure people like me in, and do God knows what to us. I live in a small town in eastern Kentucky, not far from the state university where I studied a few years back. I decided to stay in the area after graduating and took up a night job as a pizza delivery driver. Most of my deliveries are around town or to nearby neighborhoods, but sometimes I get orders from the more remote areas, places I don't usually visit after dark. One night, near the end of my shift around midnight, I got an order for a delivery in a rural area about 15 minutes out of town. This request came in during what I always referred to as the graveyard hour, right before our shop closes at midnight. I wasn't thrilled about driving out that late, especially to a secluded spot, but I grabbed the pizza, hopped into my car, and checked the directions on Apple Maps. The route took me down some winding roads, past an old abandoned mining site, and through a stretch of dense woodland. The further I drove, the fewer houses I saw, and the darker it became. The GPS finally announced that I had reached my destination. I slowed down and surveyed the area. To my surprise, the address pointed to an old, run-down warehouse surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence. The place looked somewhat abandoned, with faded graffiti covering the walls and no signs of life. Just as I was about to leave, I noticed a faint glow coming from behind a stack of crates next to the warehouse. It was a shipping container that may have been converted into a makeshift office. Despite my instincts screaming at me to get out of there, I knew my boss would be furious if I didn't deliver the pizza. Reluctantly, I got out of the car and started walking toward the container, hoping to get this over with quickly. As I got closer, I noticed two figures crouched near the container, a man holding his leg as if he was seriously injured, and a woman, clearly in distress, waving her arms and calling for help. The man's face was twisted in pain, while the woman seemed desperate for assistance. I hesitated, unsure whether to approach or leave. Then the man looked up and grinned.
Perfect timing,
He said. The woman's expression changed from nervous and fearful to a serious, focused look. Before I could react, the man dropped his act, stood up straight, and both of them started moving fast toward me. I realized too late that this was a trap. I turned to run back to my car, but the man was faster than he looked. He grabbed my arm, twisting it painfully, while the woman blocked my path, an evil look on her face. Thinking quickly, I yanked my arm free, shoved the man aside, and moved around the woman blocking the path, sprinting toward my car. I could hear them shouting behind me, their footsteps pounding against the gravel. I managed to reach my car and jumped in, slamming the door shut. Just as they reached for me, I threw the car into reverse and sped away. In my rearview mirror, I could see them standing there, watching as I escaped. I didn't stop driving until I was back on the main road, my heart racing and my mind spinning from the close call. When I finally made it back to the pizza shop, my arm was still throbbing from the cut. The place was nearly empty. Most of my coworkers had already clocked out, but a couple were still there, wrapping up the last tasks before closing. They noticed my shaken state and the fresh wound on my arm and immediately gathered around, alarmed. I quickly recounted the bizarre encounter at the warehouse. Hearing the distress in my voice, the manager quickly called the police. Officers arrived at the shop a little while later to take my statement. They asked about everything: what I saw, what I heard, the location, and descriptions of the two people. I gave them all the details I could remember about the man and the woman, though my hands were still trembling from the encounter. The officers then went to check out the warehouse themselves. I waited anxiously at the shop, along with the manager. After what felt like forever, they called back. They said the two people were long gone, but they found some disturbing items in the shipping container: tools, ropes, and drug paraphernalia. And most disturbing of all, surgical equipment. Whatever those two had planned for me wasn't good. We never found out what their intentions were, but the experience was enough to make me rethink my safety. From that night on, I've been much more cautious about late-night deliveries. My partner and I rented a cabin in a remote wilderness area for our 5-day honeymoon. My partner insisted on a cabin in the woods for our honeymoon, claiming it was less cliché than going to Hawaii. I guess he forgot about the horror movies with the same setting. We drove 2 hours from our city home to the small rental property. Upon arrival, we discovered the cabin ran on limited solar power. It had running water, but no indoor toilet. We had to use an outhouse 25 feet away. When my partner described a charming woodland house, I'd expected more modern amenities. He insisted the listing mentioned it was off-grid. We brought our luggage inside, retrieving the key from the spot the host specified. In the living room, an unusually large binder labeled "Rules" sat on the coffee table. It contained at least 10 pages of detailed instructions. Moments after my partner set the binder down, his phone alerted him to a message from the host, reminding us to read all the rules. The timing was uncanny, almost as if the host knew we were about to ignore the rules. It made us both pause for a moment. That evening, my partner turned on the dim solar-powered lights and secured all entry points. We got changed and read in bed before turning in. The following day, my partner got a drink and sat down, placing the glass on the wooden table. Another message arrived immediately, citing a specific rule about using coasters. We felt unnerved. How did they know about the drink? My partner asked if we were being watched, but the host denied it, claiming they always remind guests about coasters the morning after arrival. We spent that day mostly indoors, doing what couples do. We received no more messages, which eased my concerns slightly. The next day, we decided to hike to a nearby lake for a swim. We prepared our gear, secured the cabin, and set off down the trail near the house. We hiked for an hour through dense forest before reaching the lake. The water was clear, reflecting the sky and surrounding trees. We found a private spot on the shore and skinny dipped, relishing the solitude. The cool water refreshed us after the long hike. For a while, we forgot about the strange occurrences at the cabin and enjoyed the beauty of nature. By mid-afternoon, we packed up and began the return journey. The hike back seemed quicker. We chatted about the day's highlights, looking forward to a quiet evening at the cabin. However, as we approached, my partner noticed the door was unlocked, even though we were certain we had secured it before leaving. We entered cautiously, looking for any disturbances. On the kitchen counter, we found a note from the host. At first glance, it seemed innocuous. They had left extra towels for us, but as we read further, the note requested that we keep our intimate activities confined to the bedroom. We looked at each other, the unease growing as we realized we were being watched. we began searching the cabin for hidden cameras. My partner checked behind picture frames and inside light fixtures, while I examined the vents and corners of each room. In the bedroom, I noticed a small hole in the wall behind the headboard. I called my partner over, and we carefully removed the board, revealing a tiny camera connected to wires running through the wall. Disturbed by our discovery, we continued on with a renewed sense of urgency. We found 2 more cameras, one in the living room, disguised as a smoke detector, and another in the bathroom, hidden in a potted plant. My partner disconnected each device. As night fell, we debated our next move. My partner wanted to confront the hosts immediately, but I suggested we gather more evidence first. We decided to document everything we'd found. My partner used his phone to photograph the camera locations and the wiring we'd uncovered. While documenting the cameras, we heard a vehicle approaching. We quickly replaced the headboard and smoke detector, leaving the bathroom camera exposed. Looking through the window, we saw our host's truck pull up. They exited the vehicle and walked towards the cabin, carrying grocery bags. We quickly tried to appear normal and unfazed. I grabbed a book and sat on the couch while my partner pretended to cook in the kitchen. The hosts knocked and entered without waiting for a response. They smiled, explaining they'd brought us some local produce as a gift. As they moved through the cabin, placing items in the kitchen, I noticed them glancing at the areas where we'd found cameras. My partner engaged them in conversation, trying to gauge their reactions. The hosts stayed, making small talk about the area's attractions. My partner steered the conversation towards the cabin's amenities, casually mentioning the solar power system. The male host hesitated for a moment, but he quickly recovered, launching into a detailed explanation of the setup. His wife excused herself to freshen up in the bathroom. Moments later, we heard a muffled shout. The wife emerged, looking tense. She whispered to her husband, who abruptly cut off his solar power monologue. They quickly made excuses about forgotten errands and left, the truck's tires spitting gravel as they sped away. We immediately checked all camera locations. The exposed bathroom camera was gone, but the others remained untouched. My partner photographed the remaining cameras and wiring as evidence. We decided to call the police, using my partner's phone to avoid any potential surveillance on the cabin's landline. While waiting for the police to arrive, we heard a vehicle approaching. The host's truck pulled up and they exited, moving quickly towards the cabin. My partner locked the door and, anticipating they might have spare keys, dragged a small table in front of it, angling it to block the handle, hoping it would slow them down. We retreated to the bedroom, listening anxiously as they attempted to enter. The hosts knocked loudly, calling out that they needed to check something in the cabin. When we didn't respond, we heard them arguing quietly outside. Suddenly, there was a loud bang as they forced the door open. My partner grabbed a heavy flashlight as a makeshift weapon, positioning himself between me and the bedroom door. The hosts forced their way into the bedroom. The husband demanded to know what we'd found. The wife looked around the room. My partner held up his phone, showing the photos of the hidden cameras. The host's aggression turned to pleading. They claimed the cameras were security measures due to past break-ins. As they talked, the wife moved towards the nightstand, where my partner's phone lay. I moved to block her. The husband, seeing this, lunged for the phone. My partner shoved him back. During the scuffle, sirens approached, and the hosts froze. Realizing they were trapped, they dashed out of the cabin and drove off down a narrow side track that bypassed the main road. We watched as they sped away on the alternate route, avoiding the police cars that were closing in on the primary access road. We gave our statement to the police, showing them the remaining cameras and photos. The officers searched the property, finding additional surveillance equipment. They took our evidence and advised us to contact Airbnb. We left the cabin that night, staying at a nearby hotel. The next day, we reported the incident to Airbnb with all the details. They removed the host's listing immediately. We pressed charges against the hosts for invasion of privacy. Over the next few months, we attended multiple court hearings. The hosts eventually pleaded guilty. They paid a substantial fine and were banned from using short-term rental platforms. We received compensation as part of the settlement. Airbnb confirmed the property was permanently delisted from their platform. After the legal proceedings concluded, my partner surprised me with a redo of our honeymoon. He booked a week-long trip to Hawaii, ensuring we stayed at a reputable resort. Our days were filled with beach relaxation, snorkeling, and dinners together. The vacation was the peaceful, private getaway we originally wanted, free from prying eyes. We returned home feeling refreshed,